Hey, it's another Sunday live chat and another super special guest. We have the one, the only Charlie Clouser from Topanga, California. They call it Topanga up there?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes just the canyon, as if there was no other canyons in LA.
And your voice does sound good. That mic does sound good.
All right.
It's nice. What are you up to today? Are you staying safe inside?
Yeah, I mean, the whole, this coronavirus lockdown situation hasn't really been a huge change in my life, unlike for some folks, just because my studio's here next to my house. I don't have to travel, and it's not like I left the house ever anyway. So, but I definitely feel for guys in the touring industry, especially I'm still friends with, this guy, Bruce Hendricks, who was my keyboard tech in like 97, 98, who I hired out of Sweetwater. He was a repair tech at Sweetwater. And he's been after the NIN touring cycle ended, he just stayed on the road going from band to band. He's been Aerosmith's guy and whatever. And he literally hasn't been home for more than 2 weeks in 20 years until now.
Right.
So he's weeded the garden. He's rebuilt the deck. He's going freaking nuts over there. So I know there's a zillion other people in the touring industry that are in that same boat. And God damn, that sucks.
It's horrible. And but I've also noted that a lot of artists are staying inspired during this time or not. Like some guys are just not feeling it at all. Is the industry that you're in still feeding you work? Or is it still rolling, or is it kind of curtailed a little bit for the time being?
I mean, there's always this lag time where by the time you're scoring something, whether it's a TV show or a movie, that's 6 months to a year after they were on location or whatever. So There's going to be this weird lag time where there was still a bunch of projects in post-production when the virus situation hit. And then obviously there was a stoppage of production. So we're going to have this weird, delayed reaction, I think, probably, in the winter and spring, where people who would have expected to be scoring the next season of whatever show or something will suddenly find, oh crap, that schedule got knocked into a hat. I had, when the lockdown started in March, I guess it was, I had just finished the 9th Saw movie, and they were dubbing it up in Canada, and they finished the day the borders closed or whatever. And so fortunately I sneaked in right under the wire on that one. It was supposed to have been in theaters in May, and I'm secretly glad they did what they did, which was to just, instead of just dumping it on streaming and on demand, they said, you know what, screw it. We're going to just push it back a year. So, because there's something more fun about seeing a Saw movie in a crowded theater full of screaming people. So in theory, I think it's March or April. They've got a theatrical release date. So that'll be nice. And it's done and in the can and ready to go.
Nice. That's called Spiral, right?
Yeah. It's called Spiral from the Book of Saw. And, this is the 9th one. And Incredible. It actually, they kind of, we drove the wheels off that car pretty hard for a number of years. And then Chris Rock came to the producers and said, I have an idea for how to flip this thing. Not a reboot, not a reimagining. It's not starting at the beginning. It's in the universe of the Saw world, but a completely new take on how to approach the story. So it's Chris Rock and Sam Jackson. And,
that's amazing.
What a great world when you can hear Sam Jackson say something like, hell yeah, I want to play a game, motherfucker. I mean, it's kind of it's a best case scenario. So that'll come out in the spring, and it's in the can.
That's incredible, man. That's something I'm really looking forward to, certainly. And especially you've maintained such a close relationship with how the music in the Saw series has kind of played out. Has that been sort of like your baby over the course of time?
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
the in the first movie, that was the first film I ever scored all by myself, and it was my first solo credit on the card at the front of the movie and everything. And I actually had done it quite quickly. They were up against a short deadline, as always, and I did it very quickly. But the idea was that and this was an on purpose kind of decision between me and James Wan, the director, and Lee Wanell, his co-writer, who was actually in the first Saw movie. And we wanted the whole score throughout the main body of the movie to be really dark and murky and kind of indistinct, not sort of orchestral string parts and stuff, but it starts off sort of curious and not quite innocent, but not ultra evil. And then it gets darker and darker and darker and more indistinct and underwater until in the last sort of 10 minutes, the score has devolved into basically banging on pots and pans and screeching metal. And they had some music here and there in the temp score. And at that point in the movie, just before the very end, I think they had like Einstürzende playing out of the left speaker and Ministry playing out of the right speaker, like at different tempos. And so they just wanted mayhem and it to dissolve into mayhem and chaos. And then as is a kind of become a trademark in all the Saw movies, there's an ending montage with voiceover where the evil genius says, "So you thought you were innocent, but we have stripped back the facade of your innocence." And then there's this sort of montage of cuts of scenes from earlier in the movie, which you may not have seen all of what you're looking at. And they'll extend some of the shots or they'll have a different camera angle. And at that point, when that ending voiceover and montage starts, we wanted it to feel like the lights got switched on, and that the music all of a sudden would get very dry and bright and kind of strident. But also because there's so much information flying at the audience, it couldn't be like some flowery, complex piece of music. It kind of had to be a simple, hypnotic, yes, melodic, but not all over the place. And so out of that came a piece of music that in the first movie was called Hello Zepp. And because that's what the evil genius says at the time. And they start the tape deck and he goes, "Hello, Zepp." And that piece of music kind of became the trademark that we used in all of the movies at that point when there's the voiceover and montage. Of course, every time I have to reboot it, remix it, reinterpret it, but I'm still, even now, 16 years later, I'm still using some of the actual original audio files that were recorded in my old house up in Beechwood Canyon in 2004. So it's been great that we get to, throughout the body of the scores, try new things and refer to old melodic themes, but not reuse anything until that familiar end piece. So it's sort of like a signal to the audience. When they hear that last piece of music starting, they know that it's time to pay attention to the voiceover.
I don't think there's anybody that has seen the movie that won't. Of course, you realize at the end what's really going on, and that page change is so brilliant. And that must have been really great for you, seeing that in the rough cuts, realizing you've got a winner here. And did you impose a set of rules for yourself to really want to make it be effective in that sense that you knew what was coming, so you knew you could play with that? The idea of the murky confusion music, and then bold and really strong theme at this point. This is like kind of become, in a way, what I consider almost be like your trademark.
Well, of course, since I didn't study, orchestration or film composition at many of the prestigious programs, it's probably one of those things that a schooled film composer would say, "Yeah, duh, that's what you do." But at the time, we weren't thinking of it in terms of, "Oh, this is the format you follow. This is like the key to a successful film score," or anything. It was very much following the picture and following the storyline. And, everything throughout the body of the score and even in that ending montage piece is cued to the moment his thumb pushes the play button on the tape deck. And so it was very much like just having the music be doing a dance with the actors.
You've had an incredibly diverse career, both in music and television and film. Was it something that you felt that as you had gaining this experience over time, that this was finally your challenge that you were ready to meet?
Yeah. Because even before years in as a gun for hire synth and drum programmer for Prong and White Zombie and bands like that, and then the years spent in Nine Inch Nails, before all that, in fact, the very first job I ever had getting paid to make music was working for an Australian TV composer in New York City that had come over to score the final season of the old classic CBS cop show, The Equalizer, which now they've made movies of and everything. But the original series had originally been scored and had the theme done by Stuart Copeland from The Police. And then he left in like the third or fourth season to tour with the Police or whatever. And so this Australian guy came over to pick up the score. And I became the number 3 man on his 3-man team. So I was doing the drum programming, all the synth programming and sound design. And he had a number 2 guy that was doing the sort of piano and strings kind of stuff. And that was, I was like 23, 24 years old at the time. And that was where I got to see kind of how the sausage got made. And I got to see on the piano roll of the sequencer, what notes and how many and how these things are put together to achieve a certain type of effect. And I worked with him for a couple of years, and then that brought me to Los Angeles to work with him on other things. And that got me involved in everything that led up to the years in Nine Inch Nails. But so when I came back to scoring after I left Nails in 2001, I did a couple of records, spent a couple of years doing like a Helmet record and a couple other indie rock records. And then when the Saw movie dropped into my lap, I wasn't quite, coming in cold. I knew the terminology and the workflow and how to name and number the cues and all, I knew the sort of mechanics of it, but I had never had my hand on the stick in the left-hand seat in the cockpit. I'd always been like the number 3 guy that's in the cockpit of the plane that's, watching the fuel gauges and making sure there's not a fire on engine 4 or whatever. But so when the first Saw movie came around, then finally I was in the driver's seat and it was a great opportunity and like the perfect, thank God I wasn't coming into it completely cold. Like as one agent that I was speaking to back in those years told me, he said, it can be tough for guys coming from bands. And I kind of had to explain to him, okay, yeah, but I have years of experience as a number 3 man. I'm not going to be coming in cold. And I was really glad that I wasn't, because that really helped me under a short deadline get up and running. And, I delivered that, even though that was my first score, I delivered in full 5.1 surround with multiple stem breakouts and everything. So there was a lot of opportunity to screw it up. And fortunately, I didn't screw it up too bad.
That's amazing. And it's amazing you had the people around you to help you not get overly intimidated by the whole procedure. Just sitting in with John Debney when I was working with him on End of Days, I was just overwhelmed with like what amount of work he was taking on with scoring the orchestra and doing all of these cues that were changing on a daily basis, that I was just like, in a coming dry from a band, I was just like, what?
Well, guys like, Debney and John Powell and people like that, they're on like another freaking level. But they've spent a lifetime learning the ins and outs of those mechanics of how best to tailor what they're writing to what can be feasibly recorded with an orchestra and so on. And I spent, and you spent our lives learning different set of skills and how to manipulate a wall of busted ass 30-year-old synthesizers to do what we want instead of a string section. And that even on the first Saw movie, I did record real strings, but only for that ending piece of music, the theme at the end. And it was only a string quartet because we wanted a small, like, a very bold and up close sound. And that was it wasn't, a problem. It wasn't difficult, but it was certainly a rapid fire education in how to write monophonic lines that usually if you're just futzing around on the keyboard and you want to maybe write a string part, you might play with both hands. And then you have to go and disassemble the thing into the individual monophonic lines. And I kind of knew that since I was going to be dealing with a quartet, better to just start that way and to write with a monophonic cello line and then a monophonic viola and so on. And fortunately, I didn't get in over my head because I kind of knew I'd seen it go down from the sidelines before. And so I knew, boy, if I just do this my normal way, I'm going to really be in trouble in the 3 hours I have at the studio with the strings. So I dodged yet another bullet there.
These are a variety of rules you seem to have to set for yourself. Is that something that you learned from the experience of working with the guys, slowly but surely building up, that you realize you have to set some form of parameters that you got to achieve within a certain time?
I think I don't remember ever, that wasn't like drilled into me from experience. It more kind of came to me out of sheer terror, As you know, when you're in a room with gear and software and samples that you can make virtually any freaking sound, and in any conglomeration of noises can turn into a cool piece of music, it sometimes feels like standing in the middle of like the Bonneville Salt Flats in fog with no compass, at night, and you can walk 40 miles in any direction. And in one direction, you might come to an all-night restaurant. In another direction, you might come to a freaking cliff to fall down into a salt mine and never be heard from again. So I'm always looking to try to devise some kind of plan to avoid walking off that cliff and to hopefully head in the direction of the all-night restaurant, And there was kind of two occasions working with James Wan, where that reminded me to always think if you can of a plan before writing one note or putting one track in your template. And the first, of course, was on that first Saw movie where James said, I want it to feel like the lights get switched on in the music at this point. Okay, great. I get that. That's a very kind of abstract description of what needs to happen, but if he did even that amount of information was kind of enough for me to go, I got it. That I know what to do. It gets darker and darker, weirder, more chaotic, and then it becomes organized and formal and bright and strident. The other time that he gave me a great game plan was on the movie Dead Silence, which was a sort of throwback horror movie involving the spirit of a dead vaudeville star that was possessing ventriloquist dummies. And I was kind of fumbling around on the score for a week or so. And he came over to my place, and this was like my fourth or fifth movie maybe. And I foolishly had just started at the beginning and was just trying to chip away at it, and see what came. And James listened to what I had done, and it wasn't, there's nothing terrible, but it wasn't sort of organized. And he said, I think what you should do is go to the end, write that final piece, and then extract all the thematic riffs and little melodies and everything from that final piece and gradually reveal them throughout the movie. And of course, again, that's probably another case of, that's first week in film composer school, bro, is that you learn that. But not having that kind of upbringing and that pathway, it wasn't automatic that I would think of that. And of course, it was obviously the right thing to do. And it made the job so easy because I wrote this elaborate piece at the end that had like a music box melody that was kind of off kilter, and then strings came in and everything. And then I had all the raw material that could inform all of the smaller and less elaborate cues throughout the movie. And then at the finish line, it gave the whole score much more of a sense of like coherence and unity, and like this big triangle that's getting bigger and bigger until all the pieces are in place at the end. And so I have to keep reminding myself that of game plans that you come up with at the beginning that can really help the struggle when you're in the middle of the thing and you feel like you're wondering which way to go.
Interesting. When you how did you originally get the call or your thing for your meeting with Trent? What was the crossover there?
That was, again, it was one of those like roundabout around the side kind of things where I had come to LA to work with the Australian film composer, and I was staying on the couch or in the spare bedroom of some old friends from college who, this was like 4 or 5 years after college. And I was already like doing drum programming around town, like driving around with an MPC in the trunk of my shitty car and everything. Awesome. And I had done some because of other college. One of my closest friends from college was John Bechtel, JB, who's the keyboard player in Ministry and was in Prong and Killing Joke and everything.
Great guy.
And I love JB. He's awesome. And he was working with Prong at the time, and they wanted to have some like heavy, like ultra processed hip hop loops and stuff added underneath Ted Parsons' drums. Not like a loopy record, but just some weird turbocharged beef behind the drums. So they brought me in. I did some of that stuff, and I had a couple of kind of industrial projects like that under my belt, like Prong, and I was just starting with White Zombie at the time, because they had White Zombie and Prong had the producer Terry Date in common. So he saw what I did with Prong. He said, "Oh, I'm doing this other band, White Zombie. Might want to get in it." Anyway, another different college friend, upon whose spare room I was sleeping, was a music. He was working at a production company called Propaganda Films that was doing music video production and high-end ad spots and that sort of thing. And so he was one of many producers on the 9 Inch Nails music video for Happiness and Slavery. And they needed the sound effects of the robot chair that chops up Bob Flanagan and digests him, basically. And they were about to go, excuse me, and book a session at a normal Hollywood sound effects audio post facility to get like the of the robot arms. And Adam, my buddy, said, "Well, I got this guy, friend of mine from college. He's totally into industrial music and shit. He's a whiz with samplers and all that. I know he has like an optical disc full of dentist drill samples and jackhammers and shit. You already have all the gear here." This was when Trent was at the house on Cielo Drive, the Sharon Tate house. Of course, Trent had all the gear we would need to do the gig. He said, before we go and spend a bunch of money with some square, ordinary, normal Hollywood audio post guy, let's get my buddy over here, just see if it works. If it doesn't, no problem. And so Trent carved out, I think we had 2 days that we were going to spend to do the sound effects on the clip. And I, brought over my optical disc for the Akai S1000 full of dentist drills and jackhammers and power saws. And, you load them up in the Akai, you sync to video, you use the pitch bend wheel to simulate the motor slowing down and going, and it took us 4 hours or something to do it. And then we spent the rest of the day playing video games. And then he said, "Well, I got this band I just produced called Marilyn Manson. And we just got done recording their basic tracks off the floor. And I don't like the sound of the drums. You know about doing samples behind drums, don't you?" And I was like, "Hell yeah, I do." And so he had to go do something else. I can't even remember what it was, but he had to leave for like a week or two. He said, "Just sit here in my studio with Sean Bevan and don't change any of the drum parts on the Manson record, but just put the biggest, best sounds you can put behind it, exactly matching the acoustic recordings. No beat detective, no quantizing, just match the recordings with samples." And that was something I've done a lot already. So that was the sort of my second audition. And then I just kind of never left. I went on the road with Nails, setting up and operating the hotel room studio. And then eventually when James Woolley left the band just after Woodstock in 94, then Trent was like, hey, you're up. And I kind of had to explain to him that I was a drummer originally and had never played keyboards in front of people before. And he said, you'll be fine. And I was. And so it was, again, it was not through like normal channels. It was a weird combination of old college friends and a music video that needed sound effects.
Super, super lucky break. And then super cool. That house on Cielo Drive was pretty creepy, though. I don't know how he did it. How did he stay there?
I mean, I didn't know when I went up there, I didn't know that was the house that had such a dark past. And I thought it was just like it wasn't a big house or a mansion or anything, but it had a really nice guest house that Chris Vrenna was out in doing sampling shit off laser discs and whatever. Had a big tree in the front and a nice pool. And it just was like a cozy, secluded spot. And it totally made sense to me why you'd want to record an album there. Of course, then later when you realize what went down, it's like, oh, maybe that wasn't the best idea.
Yeah.
Of course, then when he moved to New Orleans, he freaking bought a funeral home, and that's where our studio was. So can't really escape the darkness, I guess, with him.
You guys kind of like built Production Central down in New Orleans after that. What was that studio called?
I
can't remember.
Technically, it was, I think, called Nothing Studios, but of course, you don't want that to appear on like the real estate records or the telephone directory or whatever. Yeah. So he called it Hot Snakes, which was, I think, taken from a Frank Zappa song, but was basically a joke on like, what's in the toilet the day after you go and eat Thai food, hot snakes.
So what would be the idea of like your base? I mean, things were different back then. Your basic rig back then probably would have consisted of what? S1000s or
yeah, I mean in that era it would have been Mac Quadra type computers with new bus slots, definitely Akai S1000s. They were everywhere, and Pro Tools at that point had just kind of gotten up and running but didn't have MIDI or anything.
Yeah.
And you'd have the 4-channel cards. You have the 4x4 cards. And if you had the new bus expansion chassis, you could have 4-channel cards and then the SCSI accelerator in there. And you could get 16 whole tracks. No plugins, of course.
Of course.
There's no such thing. But 16 tracks of hard disk audio. It was amazing. And at that time, we were using Studio Vision. So you could have the audio right alongside the MIDI. And we were in heaven, man.
Yeah, Studio Vision, wasn't that the one where you could create different like elements of the arrangement and then sort of try them?
So, yes. Yeah. They called them subsequences, but it's very similar to Performer's chunks, where you could trigger them by typing a letter on the keyboard, and they were like patterns in a drum machine. When one finished, the next one would start right on the grid. And I still miss that program. As crude and funky as it was, it had some workflow features that we still don't have in any other DAW of any vintage, Yeah,
Dwayne was really, he that's what he was using by the end when he first got on the Mac 2 CI, this big machine.
Yep.
And then,
and a lot of hardware synths, of course.
Yeah. There was another program at the beginning called Sound Designer 2, which was really good because you could take chunks and then you could sequence them very quickly had like a audio sequencer.
Yeah.
We used to create finished tracks on that thing. Because you could
it was great.
Crossfade the little sections.
I loved it. And we, of course, we definitely used that as a way to assemble playlists of albums or whatever. But also that was the first platform. I actually had serial number 6 or 13 or something. I bought it like the day it came out. But that was actually the first platform that had any plugins. That Waves originally came out with I think it was called the Q10. It was a parametric EQ, and then L1, which was their look ahead limiter. But they only worked as plugins in Sound Designer 2, which was just a stereo editing program. No MIDI, no multi-tracking, nothing. Yeah. But as soon as I got L1, I was in love just with turn any signal into a square brick of waveform. I was like, yeah, I like it.
I've been thinking of like I've still got a graveyard of my old computers, and I swear if I hooked them up, they'd still probably turn on.
They would.
Yeah, and so I'll probably like feel like going back and looking for one that still has a sound designer in it.
I still have a couple old G4 Mac Minis that have turbo synth on them and Mac OS 9. And it's more for nostalgia purposes than actual functionality. But there is something about the wave shaper and the sample oscillator in turbo synth that were really ugly and gritty sounding. And that was a big part of some of the NIN stuff around Broken and Downward Spiral era too, was processing guitars through different wave shapers inside turbo synth and exporting them back to the sampler.
Did you get to personally work with Adrian Belew on that stuff?
I was in the building, but not in the room. When he would come down, it would be, you know, as with a bunch of those kind of collaborative moments down in New Orleans, it was sort of a, you know, Trent would say, oh, guess what? In a month, Tony Thompson is coming down to record drums, or Adrian Belew is coming down to record guitars. We only have him for 3 days or whatever. And so we'd all be panicking, trying to like make sure everything was perfect for when he got there, that all the tracks that Trent might want him to play on were all organs. There wouldn't be any clusterfuck or confusion. We left those kind of moments up to Trent and Alan Mulder to be able to work calmly. But there was definitely a frenzy of activity to get ready for those arrivals, you know?
And to come out of, like, as you were saying earlier, the team where you learn how to do scoring and you do things, and you come right into a situation where you're working with Flood or Alan Mulder. Did you pick up things right away from these guys as to sort of like how to look at albums the way they were already looking at them and apply that to your methodologies?
You know, I tried to, and it took a while to sort of see under the hood, because both Flood and Alan are like super, like kind of calm demeanor. And it's never like, you know, it's not like working with you know, it's not like being in the studio with some loud ass metal band and they're like, fucking yeah, let's put the shit, it's not Tommy Lee. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's kind of the opposite end of that spectrum. So it took a while to realize that underneath the calm, there was like this methodology, and there was, you know, Alan has an amazing demeanor. I mean, what he went through making the Fragile album, where he was originally supposed to come for 3 months and was, you know, 18 months or whatever. But he never kind of let it get to him. And he always maintained a positive creative outlook and an enthusiasm for what more could be done. Because, you know, Trenton is a legendary perfectionist, and okay, let's scrap that and try it again kind of guy. And it takes a certain kind of demeanor and a zoomed out view for someone like Alan to be able to not sort of get lost in the muck in the middle of the process. And then when it comes to more kind of techno studio geekery, you know, for a big part of that process, I was kind of the guy driving the computer, and Alan was driving the console and all the hardware. So there was a lot to be learned from watching how because Trent had all the classic outboard, all the Pultex LA2As, 1176, all the normal stuff that a big setup would have back then. And so there was a lot of gear that I had never owned before. And so it was very helpful to watch when and where those classic pieces of hardware would get deployed by Alan.
Were you still on Pro Tools by that point?
Yeah, we were at that point. At some point in the middle of the Fragile, I think we switched to Logic, because, you know, Gibson bought Opcode and then discontinued Studio Vision, and It died a horrible, ignoble, you know, a not very dignified death that was also sudden. And by that point, I had already been using Logic, I think, for a little while. And we were able to use Logic as the front end, but still have it access the Digidesign hardware. So it's kind of the best. Logic was never, in those days, it was never as kind of clear cut as what Studio Vision was. The manuals felt like they were translated from German, because they probably were. And it was a little kind of weird. but it worked. And it had some great features like loop audio record where, you could set an 8-bar chunk over a drum beat, put it in audio record, and then leave the room while Trent puts his head down and plays. And it would just stack up as 8-bar pieces of audio, muting each one as it created a new one. And then you could come back in and digest it after the fact. And it made some of the process of recording the Fragile a lot different than before, and a lot simpler and faster in other ways too.
And then as time would have it during that period, of course, you guys are seeing lots of successes. I believe, didn't a Grammy come during that time? Certain.
I think that was just before I came on board, and it would have been, I think it was for a song from Broken called Wish that got Best Metal Performance or something. But I believe that occurred when I was either in and out, but it was definitely before New Orleans, I think.
But as you were all working up and building with that machine, that factory down there in New Orleans, I was hearing through rave at the time, it was just like, sounded like some pretty exciting stuff. And was it a good environment for you to be in, or was it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of a bit, I think the production and the process of the Fragile might have suffered a little bit because of the sheer size of the operation and the number of people bouncing off the walls in that place. I mean, there was Robin Fink didn't stick around too long after the Downward Spiral. He did move to New Orleans because Trent was like, I want my live band to be there. I want you guys to contribute to the next album. And we're going to do this side project, the famous side project that never happened. And we're going to do remixes, and I'm going to do another Manson album. And so I want everybody, pile on. And Robin came to town for, I can't even remember how long he was there. Couldn't have been as long as a year. But, you had me and Danny and Chris Vrenna, later became Jerome Dillon, then a studio manager, a receptionist. At one point, we needed some more hand. I found this guy named Keith Hillebrandt, great sound designer and programmer, who had made some sample CDs called Diffusion of Useful Noise that were very much like the old poke in the ear with a sharp stick kind of early industrial sample CDs of like really tortured noises. And somehow I got one of his discs, and I thought, this guy's great. I showed Trent some of the sounds that he had done. And we at first hired him to do a bespoke collection of sounds just for us, to serve as raw material for dumping into the Akais and processing and stuff. And then eventually Trent said, can we just hire this guy full time? Bring him down here. So he jumped on board. Then a little bit later, I had been talking to DigiDesign, now Avid, about tech support issues with Pro Tools and Logic and everything so often that they finally put me in touch with a single support engineer that I could have a direct line to. And so I'm calling this guy and asking about syncing up Pro Tools to the analog multitracks and all this kind of stuff. And because I was kind of the point man to keep all the rigs running, and we had like 5 or 6 Pro Tools rigs at that point. And so I'm talking to this guy so often that finally, again, it was another case of Trent saying, you know what, see if he'll quit his job at DigiDesign and move to New Orleans and be our in-house genius. And that was Steve Duda, who became one of the creators of BFD, the drum sample engine, and then of course the Serum software synth, which is his, which absolutely rules the world of EDM and dubstep and all that, and sounds amazing. And so that was one of the, we kept bringing people in, and the crew got bigger and bigger. And then there was a Manson album, Antichrist Superstar was done at the studio in New Orleans. So now you got the Manson guys bouncing off the wall, and that's not a calm environment. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can only imagine.
So I think some of that level, it was all done with the best of intentions and the highest of hopes. But I think at some point, just the sheer number of people, because, Trent's used to working with 1 or 2 other people, maybe an engineer, maybe Chris Vrenna, that kind of thing. Like when I first came into Trent's world, it was Chris Vrenna, Sean Bevan, That's it. Sean Bevan behind the console, Chris Verena behind the computer, Trent Reznor on the mic and guitar. And that worked very well. That's how, most of Downward Spiral was done, of course, with Flood and Alan and everything. But it wasn't this like 4,500 square foot building with 6 production rooms down the hallway. And I think at some point it did get to be like just too much. So after a while, me and Danny would just kind of hide up in our little studios on the second floor, try to stay out of Trent's way and like give him the peace and quiet needed to freaking concentrate on the job at hand instead of, hey man, I got a new bass line for that. Right. It was just too much activity, I think, at one point.
A lot of pressure, and especially when things are rolling well and going well. And then I remember seeing that tour, I think it was the 94 tour, Nine Inch Nails with Marilyn Manson opening. And no one had seen him yet. And then he came out and he was incredibly charismatic.
Oh, yeah.
It was almost as though did you feel at some point that, my God, have we created a monster?
I mean, and Manson's a smart dude. I mean, he's not like, it's not just flamboyance for flamboyance sake. And, everybody kind of, it's many, many years ago now, but like remember when the Columbine school shootings took place? Before school shootings were like an every week kind of thing. Yeah. And it was just an uproar with, is it the devil's music that's that's poisoning these kids' minds? And they got Manson on, I don't know if it was Phil Donahue or Sally Jesse, some like daytime talk show. And, and the question posed to him was, well, what would you have said to the Dylan Klebold and Harris, whatever the other kid's name was? What would you have said to them to try to, prevent this national tragedy? And without missing a fucking beat, he said, I wouldn't have said anything. I would have listened. And, exactly the perfect answer that nobody had thought of in all the furor of media and talking heads on TV and people with, Dr. Phil level fucking degrees or whatever. Not one of them clocked that fact. And it was just one of the best shutdowns in television history,
I guess he did feel like that event, the Columbine event, did sort of like affect his career quite dramatically.
I mean, nobody wants to be associated with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or to have fingers pointed at you as the cause or whatever. But I think he handled it as well as it could be handled from the position he was in. And as we look now, I mean, he's still going and he's still cranking out rad records. And, I got nothing but love for Manson.
He's my neighbor, but I've never met him.
That sounds about right. That's in character.
He lives up in the hood here too.
Yeah.
But I walked my dog past his house and I would always thought that he'd like stick his head out and go, hey! But no, I guess he's not. I guess he's quiet, huh?
And there's not like purple smoke coming out from underneath the door or anything.
It's like quite civilized. I mean, you'd never know otherwise. It's like David Hasselhoff's ex-wife lives there next to him, and she's like, "Oh, you don't know Brian?" And I'm like, "Well, of course, through his music, or maybe I don't know." But oh yeah, it's like one of these neighborhood things in Hollywood where typical. Okay, he lives there.
Brian, you forgot to put the trash cans out.
He does have a lot of trash cans. So. I don't know. It's a very, I call it the peak period of everything, really, when you guys were down there. And it must have felt like it, too, the golden era. The downward spiral through the fragile is really like, isn't it really like, well, I mean, it's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, I'm sorry to hear that your name has not been included on that list. I think it's a little bit of a travesty. Because for me, the Nine Inch Nails that I always consider is like you, Fink, Loner, Brenna.
I mean, I kind of figured it was going to work out like that. When somebody said, "Oh, did you see Nine Inch Nails is getting in Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?" I was like, my first reaction is, really? But then I figured, oh, well, it'll be Trent and maybe Atticus because he's an official member now. And then, so I just figured, that's how it's going to go down. And, to be fair, it's certainly, I mean, I was in the band for whatever, 6-7 years, something like that. A fifth of my career, a fifth of the band's timeline. So I think it's far more important that guys like Vrenna and Danny and Rob, I mean, Robin's still in the band, So Robin, no question. Vrenna, no question, because he was there in the macaroni and cheese and ramen noodle van tour era. I didn't have to suffer. By the time I came on board, it was 8 Prevost H45 buses, so I didn't have to pay the dues like Vrenna did. And of course, Danny, like one look at him and you say, yeah, that's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame material right there. So I kind of figured it was going to work out that way. And, even though I was in the band for 6 or 7 years, whatever it was, we only made one damn record in that whole amount of time. I mean, a bunch of remixes and a bunch of Bowie tour and this and that and a lot of stuff. But it wasn't like, it wasn't like I'm John Frusciante appearing at 4 different crucial moments in the Chili Peppers history or whatever.
Right.
And John didn't even go to the fucking Chili Peppers induction. He was like, fuck that shit.
Was he invited?
I think, yeah. And I think he was like, no, I don't want to. I don't know.
I love John.
He's the best.
He's the best for that. I mean,
he's so enthusiastic about the music. That's all he cares. He doesn't even care if like you hear it or you like it or don't. He just needs to do it and get it out of him. So the fact that he's had, global chart topping success with the Chili Peppers, I think to him is probably like kind of secondary. I remember we actually went, he and I and Danny went together to see Nails play when they did their 5 nights at the Palladium a year or 2 ago, whenever it was. And I remember saying, I said, so we were walking down the street, we had dinner and then we're walking down the street towards the Palladium. And I said something to John, like, I can't even remember. It was something like, do you ever, cause he asked me, is it weird going to see Nails now that you're not in the band? I was like, no, I'm sure it'll be a cool show. I mean, dude, that was 20 years ago when I quit the band, and I said, why don't you go see Chili Peppers? And I see Danny, like I catch Danny's eyes, kind of walking behind us, and Danny's going, no, like, because I didn't know like what acrimony, what conflict, what the circumstances were. I just thought like he was like, I feel like doing some solo albums. I'm going to quit now, whatever.
Yeah. And
Danny's going, don't get into that topic, and John was like, no, they wouldn't be too happy to see me show up at the. I was like, oh, I was all good. I was like, I'm fine with. I'm definitely go see a Nails show, and they kicked ass at Palladium. It was great.
Yeah. I think that the whole thing about John and like his mission at one point, seemingly, I think it was something happened when he saw Venetian Snares. He realized that, and I remember I was at that show with him, and he it's like something really changed, and he started speaking about how he didn't operate a computer. He hadn't as yet operated a computer. And so Aaron Funk brought him up to Winnipeg and basically gave him the mega Venetian Snares training program, which John apparently passed. If you've listened to his recent albums, it's quite amazing. And then so some of the stuff that he sent me was like some of this. He sent you that cut up stuff of all the 70s psych albums that he did. I mean, it's like absolutely brilliant. And then so he's completely nailed this whole other world. And then I guess, he's become the master of like the MC202s and the very difficult little boxes. And so now that he's at that point, maybe he's realized, hey, now I can go back because I've conquered like what I was thinking about.
Right. It's like he conquered one of the great mysteries of life, and now it's that. And I was this would have been like, I don't know, 2001, 2002 or so. And I had met him and hung out with him a little bit when Nails would play festivals with Chili Peppers, but we weren't like best buds or anything. But Danny Lohner knew him a lot better than I did. And I think it might've been Danny that called me and said, "Hey man, can you help John? He wants to get into modular synthesizers." And of course, in that era, that was before like the current Euro rack fucking revolution and hailstorm of modules. It was really like you could get the Wired system, and there was a couple of others, the Technosaurus and Dupfer was just starting with the Euro rack stuff. And they had more or less a complete selection and variety of modules. And so John came up, and I didn't have any big modular setup. I had an old Moog modular from the 60s and a couple of other pieces. John came over to my house in Beechwood Canyon, and we talked about it, and I showed him some stuff on what crude gear I had. And then I told him about Dupfer and how they make, it's very inexpensive. So if you make a mistake and buy a module you don't like, it's not the end of the fucking day, And he's like, "Okay, thanks for the info." And then like a month or two later, he calls me up and he's like, "Can you come over to my house and show me a couple things?" I was like, "Sure." And I go in and he's got everything that Dupfer makes, like a fucking tower of Dupfer racks sitting on the floor cross-legged with the cables, like, "Okay, where do we begin?" And so I gave him a few tutorials of just like how to not lose your mind on that stuff. Because I had grown up doing that shit in college on ARP 2500, the one with the slider bus bars and everything. So it wasn't, that was something that I kind of already knew and had almost gotten bored with and moved past. And I wasn't like really doing modular stuff anymore in 20 years ago. So I was able to help him get up and running, and boy, did he run with it, Yeah.
Did you make an album with him in 2004? Shadows Collide in People?
What's that? I lost you there for a second.
Did you make an album with John in 2004, Shadows Collide with People?
I helped a bit here and there, but I wasn't like in there grinding on it like he was, I contributed bits and pieces and helped him get in there and helped him puzzle his way through some musical goals or whatever. But it's definitely a Frusciante solo album for sure.
It must be kind of inspiring along the way that you realize that you've inspired all the people that are like guys like Gary Newman, David Bowie, and David Lynch, Oliver Stone. All these people that have just kind of come along, and then I gather it must have been exciting for you knowing that this could be a perfect thing for the future, to know that these doors are opening with certain fantastic filmmakers.
Well, it's weird at the time. You almost don't think of that. Yeah. At the time, it's like it's wild and amazing, but you're never thinking of how that piece fits into. It's already so off the charts of like, can you fucking believe this? Bowie wants to tour with us? Like, what is? And at that point, all ability to think reasonably about things has left the building, and you're just like, it's one amazing. You're like, that's got to be just an accident. He must have misdialed the.
So doing songs with Bowie on stage, you were the keyboard guy on that tour.
Yep.
I mean, that had to be worth your whole life experience just to do
absolutely.
And be on a day-to-day basis with a guy coming in and being like, "Oh, hey David, where's the building?"
I mean, I wish camera phones had existed then. I'd have a lot more photos.
I know, it's like the dark period of which nobody was able to capture.
Mm-hmm.
What were the standout moments of that type of experience?
Well, musically, walking into SIR rehearsal in New York, having never met Bowie, and walking in, and they were in the midst of rehearsing, because we had this crossover section in the set where we'd play almost a full set, and then there was 5 or 6 songs where gradually, first Bowie would come out and sing with us, and then gradually, as we ping-ponged between Bowie songs and Nails songs, more and more members of his band would join us, until at one point in the middle of that crossover section, all members of both bands were on stage at once, like 3 drummers. I mean, it was out of control. And then gradually the Nails members would leave until at the final song in the crossover point is Trent singing with Bowie and his whole band, but no other Nails members. So one of the songs in that crossover section was going to be Hurt by Nine Inch Nails. And we walked into SIR rehearsal, and Bowie and his band are up on the little stage, and oh, hi guys, we're just going to run through this one more time and then we can talk. Okay. And then they launch into their mutated version of Hurt with Reeves Gabrel's like weird kind of atonal pattern that he plays on the guitar. And then to hear Bowie singing that song. I mean, I didn't write that song. I don't sing that song. It's not my song. I'm a peripheral participant at best, you know, but it was definitely chills down the spine. Holy fuck kind of moment. I can only imagine how hard that must have hit for Trent to see one of his heroes singing and flipping the script on one of his songs. That musically, that was the most shocking highlight. And but also Carlos Alomar has been a huge, like, he's one of my favorite musicians of all time, and he's been present and integral in so many like points at which music changed for me. You know, when you hear something he played and you think, wow, I'll never think of guitar or music the same way again. And so he was a big, you know, a big force in my musical upbringing. And I remember it was at one point in the crossover set, I'm actually playing drums on like Scary Monsters and Hello Space Boy. I'm going back to my first instrument and playing drums. And so I had this great big riser with a keyboard setup and a drum set. And Carlos would jump up on the freaking drum riser. And I mean, Carlos Alomar is a godlike figure, but even still, he was wearing kind of like a blouse, like a fluffy shirt with like snake skin print or leopard print or something. And he's playing like a pink fucking Jackson guitar or something. And he's short strapping it. You know, he's got the fucking thing jacked way up here. Like, bro, lengthen that strap, please. And he would jump up on the riser and be doing the, you know, and you're thinking, your first reaction is, dude, don't do the short strap dance next to my drums. We're trying to look badass up here. But then you realize, like, it's Carlos fucking Alomar. He can short strap it and puffy shirt it all he wants. He's earned the right to be utterly beyond criticism. And we would always take one shot of 1800 of Cuervo tequila before going on stage. And one time he wandered into the dressing room and he was like, what are you drinking that stuff for? That's for little kids. I'll be right back. And he goes and he brings out a bottle like the Herradura Ultra Platinum Private Reserve or whatever. And of course, that's the tequila he had hits a lot harder. And then after the show, and he's able to toss back this from the bottle. The rest of us are like choking and sputtering from one shot. But so he and it didn't even dent him. All that like Herradura Double Reserve, whatever he was drinking. The rest of us are like going, whoa, that's so heavy duty. So not only can he play us all under the table, but he can also drink us all under the table.
What a great experience. I mean, jamming with one of your idols. Is like,
right.
So after that, you did I'm Afraid of Americans. And what was that session like?
Well, that was just, I mean, you know, Trent and David collaborated on the album version, which I wasn't really involved in. I think to a large degree, David already had the song, and Trent did a bunch of production and sort of flippery to subvert it a little bit, and of course sang on it as well. And then I did a remix of it, which was at the time I was super into like Portishead and Square Pusher and stuff. And so I did this remix that basically deconstructed the song and slowed the tempo down and like turned it into this echoey, murky, weird mess. It was just sort of like, have fun with it. We're doing a remix EP that's going to have like 10 remixes on it, whatever you want. No, there was no like approval process or, okay, we like it, but could you change one thing? It was just sort of do whatever you want, man. And it was a lot of fun. and great to have actual Bowie vocals on your hard drive.
Yeah, no, really. I mean, it's a killer track too. Still
I mean,
stands up.
Bowie was one of the first actual album LP that I ever bought
Really?
was at a yard sale in Pennsylvania, and it was David Live, which was a double album from his like sort of Thin White Duke plastic soul kind of period. And this would have probably been 77 or 78 or so, somewhere around there. And that was him playing it was a double album of one of his concerts from, I think, like the Tower in Philly. And so that was, the fact that his was one of the first LPs I could ever afford on my meager allowance in middle school. Made that experience even more poignant.
That's cool. I mean, really, if you look at your list of bands that you were working your through time and stuff, it seems like every graveyard band in America really has had a tenure with you. Rob Zombie, White Zombie, Marilyn Manson, Nine Inch Nails. Then you get more creative. You even work with Fetus. Is that just is that a remix or is that a?
Yeah, that was a remix, and Trent was already friends with Jim, and we met and hung out when we had some days off in New York at one point, I think. And I do remember this would have been, I think, on Bowie tour. And I think we were in that restaurant just across from the entrance to Lincoln Center. There's like a bar restaurant that's like on the point where Broadway and I thought I was going to sneeze. Where like Broadway and 7th Cross or something. And stolen sneeze again. And
let it happen.
I hate it when you get robbed of the sneeze, man. And I think at one point, like a bottle flew across the room at Bowie and so forth. But when Fetus was, I can't remember which album that track was from, but it was another case of, hey, let's get all the maniacs from the Nails crew to see who wants to do a remix. And that was a lot of fun because it was sort of turbo industrial groove with time stretched granulated vocals, and it was a lot of fun. It was kind of in that era, there was a lot of new technology that we were just seeing for the first time that now is all on like an app on your phone. But at the time, like having a granular time stretcher was like, oh man, how can I use this? I'm going to be first out of the box and grind up Fetus's vocals in this weird time stretching algorithm and put it on my remix.
Dude, was that done down in New Orleans, or did he send you stems or something?
He sent me a bunch of stems, and then I just did it in my little dungeon at the second floor of Trent's studio in New Orleans.
Man, you've got to work with Alice Cooper.
Again, that was another like. I don't even remember if I was ever in the room at the same time as him, but that was a case of, Rob Zombie and I got on great during the programming work that I added to the White Zombie album, Astro Creep 2000, where I was putting, taking hip hop loops, chopping them up to match John Tempesta's drum parts, rearranging, and then like squashing the shit out of them in Waves L1 and hiding all that stuff kind of behind what John Tempesta was playing. Didn't want it to sound like there was a set of loops and a drummer playing along to the loops. It wanted to sound like one big unified thud. And so it was a lot of, in the era of before like sample replacers and Drumagog and all the technology that makes it so easy, it was all just done by hand with Akai samplers and MIDI notes and nudging stuff and trying to get it exact. And so Rob and I got on great during that process. And I did add some synth stuff and some sample work, like flipping samples from old movies and stuff that he had. And then I wound up doing a whole bunch of remixes for the remix album from Astro Creep, which was called Super Sexy Swinging Sounds. And we got on so good with that when he decided to break up White Zombie and go solo, it was like, okay, you're my guy. Let's do this. And we started generating tracks, some of which became things like the Alice Cooper track and, other various weird one-offs. Like there was a song in the Beavis and Butthead movie that we did together. And stuff like that. So there was, and just when the first Rob Zombie solo album was about to like kick into gear was exactly the time that Trent was like, hey, guess what? You're now the keyboard player and we're going to finish out this tour. And then, hey, you want to move to New Orleans? And so I kind of had to walk away from what might have been, I mean, who knows how it would have gone, but it might have been that I could have stayed, had much more of an involvement in Rob's solo stuff. As it was at the time, I was sharing a house with this Canadian producer named Scott Humphrey, who, yeah, you know, everybody knows Scott. And he was already like heavily involved in like big, loud, heavy music, and had a way better setup than me and way more experience at like tracking live drums and that kind of thing. So he kind of jumped, you know, it was fortunate that we were living in the same house because Rob kind of already knew him through that connection. So that became, Scott really jumped into the driver's seat on all the Rob Zombie solo stuff, and that worked out great because they were a perfect match.
Man, you must have never got any sleep back in the day before the time, as you say, the drum fixing softwares have come into. Is there anything that's been released that really is like the big savior software for that now?
I mean, Beat Detective still, I've just been using it a bunch.
Yeah.
I don't live in Pro Tools and I don't track a ton of live drums. When I'm tracking, I do record my own drums for most of my scores just over in the living room. But when I'm doing that, I'm generally not recording 16 mics. I have this Crane Song mic preamp and mixer thing that has 8 mic pre's, but also is an 8x2 mixer and super hi-fi and super class A and badass and blah, blah, blah. But it lets me put up, you know, overheads and room mics and far mics and commit to a mix right there and record it just in stereo. So when I'm doing my own scores, I just record in stereo, since it's just a stereo file, I can like very easily edit and quantize. I can drop the audio into Ableton and just hit Command J and quantize it. And it's very, very quick. But recently I was doing a whole lot of recording, also here at my house, that I did need to have multi-track mics. And so I had to fire up Pro Tools yet again and get into Beat Detective. And it's amazing what it does. Because it's not like time stretching. It's not like messing with anything, really. It's just cutting, moving, filling the gaps, and crossfading. And I can only, you know, one of you probably know Paul DeCarli too, who was Scott Humphrey's assistant programmer guy for many, many years. And Paul had for years made a great living manually doing what Beat Detective does.
Right.
On records for Michael Beinhorn and for Bob Rock, and like a lot of the big 90s modern rock records were actually had their drums quantized by Paul secretly, you know, on the down low, right? Yeah. And he would have to do that. This was before Beat Detective. He would do basically exactly what Beat Detective does, but completely manually. Incredible. And I don't know if he was involved in the development of Beat Detective, but he should have been, because it's exactly what he used to do. And that's been amazing. And I got to say, as much flack as Pro Tools takes, and as infrequently as I use it, because I'm mostly a Logic guy, I gotta give it up to him. It is an amazing piece of software. I mean, it's ugly and clunky in some ways, but for other things, good Lord, for doing audio editing and Beat Detective, it's ridiculous how good it is. And unlike most DAWs, if you tell it to do something to the 96,000th of a millisecond or whatever the hell, that's exactly where that piece of audio goes. And there's no funny business. There's no, oh yeah, I snapped to zero crossings, I hope you don't mind. There's no like bullshit, you know? And if you need things to be mechanical and exact in your audio editing, it's the freaking king, and I love it. And I don't use, you know, I still don't use fancy drum sample replacement engines like slate drum, slate trigger, or Drumagog or any of those. I still, because this is the way I did it, 20 years ago. In Logic, I put up the audio, go into the audio editor, and do convert audio to MIDI. Now it's crude as hell, and it's not even. Most people don't even. They picture that function as being used to convert a piano part into MIDI so they can trigger a new. But for drum and when you're doing melodic stuff, obviously it's going to miss some notes. Some notes are going to be the wrong octave. It's going to be maybe inaccurate, whatever. But when you use convert audio to MIDI for drums, Logic is like, yeah, that's easy. And it does take some manipulation of the MIDI after the fact of like separating it into different tracks and moving shit around. But that's the way I used to do it 20 years ago. And it's still there and it still works. And I've just kind of got that workflow down. So when I need to trigger samples on top of a recorded acoustic performance, I just bang them into Logic and go, oh, here we go again. And you just kind of grit your teeth and go through the process. It's a little crude, but it can be accurate, and it's very simple. So I wind up just using that instead of the more modern fancy solutions.
And Beat Detective is Pro Tools only, right?
Yeah, it is.
One of those things you got to sign up, name your name with the Scientologist to get.
Yeah, just about. I mean, it's even if it was just for that one function, it'd be worth whatever the hell they're charging, because the amount of time it saved me is unbelievable. And the results are, you can precisely tailor how far you want it to fill in the gap, how long the crossfade is. And I mean, they didn't miss a trick. And it's old technology by this point, but they don't need to make it any better. It kind of was perfect from the get-go. So I'm fine with it.
So eventually, I guess, like the studio and working on music and stuff like that, you were being drawn, as you said earlier, back into the film industry with interesting offers. And then that probably at one point you said, hell, I don't want to go on the road anymore. I don't want to be around all these crazy people. I feel like, well, hold on, wait. Film industry might have some crazy people, but I'll deal with them instead.
Well, I've always been more of like a lab rat than a road dog. That's my little sound bite, right? Like, I like being in a studio. I like it to have windows, but I like being in a room with a lot of fancy gear and a fast computer and just trying to find new sounds instead of beating the shit out of myself night after night playing the same sound. Now, to be fair, playing keyboards and nails is like the best possible keyboard gig there is. By the time I got into nails and came to LA, I had already had a record contract and been in a band and made an album that cost way too much at a giant country club studio, and had the album not sell, and had the tour suck, and had a band member OD, and like, I was like, okay, I'm fucking done with this. By the time I joined Nails, I was almost 30, and I was like, I didn't come to LA to join bands, I was like, fuck all that shit. I just did that, and it was 4 years out of my life. And it sucked, and it was fun at first. And like, oh, we're making an album. Oh, we're going on tour. And then there's always a down. There's always a climb, and there's always a decline. And so when I came to LA, I wasn't trying to get in bands. And I was like, plus, I couldn't really play drums. The band I was in New York that had a record deal and everything, I was the drummer, but I wasn't that good. I had good ideas, but I didn't have the stamina or the mechanical dexterity to render my ideas that I wanted. So that's why I got into drum machines and programming, because then I could render what I heard in my head. And so by the time I came out here, I was like, I knew I wasn't going to be a session drummer in LA and like battle it out with those cats, because they're good and I wasn't. And I wasn't a good enough keyboard player. I was a studio programmer keyboard player, So I knew I wasn't going to be like going on the road as a keyboard player in a band, except I thought maybe someday if Kraftwerk is hiring, I literally was like, there's no bands that I could do a good job playing keyboards in, except maybe Kraftwerk, which I'm kind of mostly joking, but
Yeah.
if the opportunity came up, of course I would shave my head and put on the fucking jumpsuit, or 9 Inch Nails, because Nails, because my friend JB was, in Killing Joke and Prong and everything. And those weren't like keyboard. Keyboard was sort of an afterthought in those bands. It was an adjunct. It's all about the guitar, bass, and drums. And then you got a keyboard player on the side playing like a weird siren noise every once in a while. So, and not to, I'm exaggerating and not to talk shit on JB because he's awesome. But but 9 Inch Nails, the keyboards were kind of central to the whole operation, And so when that opportunity came up, I was definitely going to pursue it, even though I was not a keyboard player technically. And of course, all thanks to Trent for saying, don't worry, I'm sure you'll be fine. You got this.
Well, he gave you the biggest challenge on earth to have to perform and then have some crazy guy come and destroy half your keyboards during your set. Like, how do you play with some guy that's like destroying your
Oh, I love that. I wanted to nail.
That would be great. But what'd you do? Did you just have to like step back and be like, hey, where's the other one? There must have been another one backstage.
Yeah. We had dozens of them. And that was my favorite thing about Nails. And that I wanted to be a full-on battle. I wanted to see blood and injuries and somebody leaving in an ambulance, not from the audience, from the stage. Like that's as soon as I saw what they were doing in the Downward Spiral tour, in the self-destruct tour, I was like, fuck yeah, that's what I want. I want at the end of the show, the fucking building should collapse. That's what I wanted. And, if there's somewhere there exists a VHS tape that Jonathan Rock, who was the tour videographer at the time, made of my first show, because I joined in the middle of that tour. I basically had to learn. Sean Bevan made me a DAT tape that had, of the live set, that had the whole band on the left speaker and just the keyboard parts from James Woolley on the right. And then they gave me one of their backup samplers loaded with the banks and were like, figure it out.
Wow.
So I just had to figure it all out by ear, by listening to that DAT and figuring what key, what sample he was triggering, what he was playing. And then they slotted me in while the tour was up and running. And my first time playing keyboards in front of people was almost 20,000 people on New Year's Eve. So it wasn't like it wasn't like any there was no rehearsals or training period at all. It was like sound check and you're on. But somewhere there exists a VHS tape, which we couldn't find it in New Orleans, but we turned the building upside down looking for this tape. And Jonathan Rock, the tour videographer, made this tape of focusing just on me on my first night. And I definitely do some unfortunate things, like when Trent's playing the keyboard that's hanging off the side of the drum riser and he's playing the keyboard solo in Happiness and Slavery. And I don't really remember this, but apparently it's on tape. Apparently I came down off the keyboard riser and pushed him out of the way and started playing the keyboard. And he looked at me like, what the fuck are you think you're doing, bro? Because I sort of thought it was like, it's every man for himself, It was the impression, because I hadn't really been indoctrinated into exactly like the protocol for like how to be deferential to the guy whose fucking band it is. Yeah. So apparently I was, behaving out of beyond established precedent. And I wish we had that tape. I would love to be embarrassed by it one more time.
I mean, like, what's the most keyboards you ever saw damaged on a single night?
Oh, I mean, it was, probably 5 or so. There was one that you knew was going to get done. That was the one that just didn't even have a stand that Trent brought out, and he would shred the keys off with his foot. So you knew that one was going down. The one that hangs off the drum riser was probably going to get mic standed. Danny's keyboard would definitely get done at least once or twice, usually with water. And I would usually I would have to have a spare brought in halfway through the show for sure. And fortunately, we had, in those days, we used all the keyboards on stage were brown DX7s, the originals, which are built out of metal and they're fucking rugged. And you could still get parts if you needed like one key. You could order just, a D sharp or whatever. And they were easy to waterproof. You could put silicone and saran wrap inside to like at least so they wouldn't just die instantly when they got hit with water. And they were cheap as hell. You could any city you could be in like, Kenosha, Wisconsin and be like, oh, we're running low on DX7s and go to some pawn shops and music stores and come back with 5 or 6 of them for $200-300 each. So it was a very wise decision on Trent's part to just say, you know what, all keyboards on stage are Brown DX7s. They only have MIDI out going to the actual hardware is off stage.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't matter if they break.
Okay.
And it's just a MIDI cable,
So it didn't matter. There wasn't any sounds inside it. You were.
Oh, no.
Interesting. Okay, that makes a heck of.
Yeah, it was all offstage sound engines. In the downward spiral or self-destruct era, it would have been Emax 2 rack samplers that had a hard drive. And of course, and then later on the Fragile tour, it was emulator E4s.
Right.
And we always used EMU samplers because they've always had a function where you can designate an incoming MIDI program change number to act as if you're pushing the load bank button on the front. And then the next MIDI program change that comes in will select what bank on the hard drive you want to load. So on a DX7, now on a normal synth, you'd have to type in the numbers on like a telephone pad. But on a DX7, you have those 2 strips of buttons, which with one touch send a program change. So we'd always set them up that button number 32, the last one, is the load bank button. And then the other 31 select the bank. So when you need to load the bank for a particular song, you just push 32 and then the number of the song. And it zip, 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 loads a hard drive and you're ready.
Wow.
And so EMU samplers and DX7s is like still the best choice 20 years later.
I think that's a secret that you just let out because I've never heard that. And there's people with pens out there writing it down right now.
It's in this day and age, everybody would use like main stage or whatever. That approach would be a little crude. But as you can see, if you watch those old live videos and live, concert videos, this shit's just bouncing off, this keyboard's flying all over the place. And a guy, John Van Eaton or somebody will run out, plug in the new one, boom, 32, 16, ready. You just push 2 buttons and you're up and running. And the Emaxs themselves are located way off stage, safely hidden from any water bottles that might come flying. Yeah.
Yeah, I was chatting briefly with Danny Lohner. He said to say hi. He said to say, don't forget to mention that Charlie's definitive moment, Starfuckers Inc. Was that like more so a Charlie idea?
Well, kind of. I mean, at that point we were, each of us band members would be like hidden in our little dungeons trying to generate raw material for either the 9 Inch Nails album in progress or the possible side project that we never really got together going. Or we're trying to overdub elements on tracks that Trent has started. Because even though this was like 1997 or whatever, we had a file server that we would upload files to so that we didn't have to be in the same room to collaborate. I mean, at the time we were freaking cutting edge. We thought this was the most advanced. And it was Steve Duda that set all that up. Oh, and we thought we were so like, boy, this is so rad. We can share songs on a server. It's ridiculous. And so I was trying to generate, and at that point I was we had just gotten done with a tour leg where Atari Teenage Riot was opening up.
Right.
I love Alec Empire. I love Atari Teenage Riot. I think it's conceptually, it's perfect, and live, it's even better. Oh, and it's like exactly what I want to hear. So 909 through a Marshall stack, and it's awesome. So we just gotten back off that leg of a tour, and I was feeling inspired by that vibe, and I had this. At that time, I was buying like every piece of gear that Trent didn't buy because why bother, right? Yeah. So I would wind up with stuff like the Quasi MIDI Revolution 309 Techno Groove box, right?
Still have one.
And it was kind of a cool little box. It was all digital, which was garbage, but it was trying to be like an 808, 909, and 303 in a piece of hardware with knobs. that you could automate the knobs for like the kick drum decay time and everything. It sounded a little plasticky, but conceptually it was cool. So I had one of those, and my usual army of guitar pedals and some inspiration from Atari Teenage Riot. And the whole track under the verse of Starfuckers is that Revolution 309 through like some DOD guitar pedals. And what sounds like a synth bass is actually its 808 kick going through a bunch of distortion that makes it sound like a square wave type synth bass. Perfect. And I recorded it in mono because like the pedal had a mono output. And I just had this like slab of jams as I'm twisting the knobs and adjusting stuff on the pedals and that. And I kind of chopped it up into somewhat of a song arrangement and stuck it on the server. And then turns out Trent used that as the starting point for the song Starfuckers. And of course, he wrote the big power guitar chorus and everything. But the verse is basically just that mono track from my Quasi Midi. And then after he had recorded vocals, he said, can you think of something interesting to do to the vocals so that at least during the verses, so they're not just sort of me singing over a drum machine. And of course, this was in the era before fancy plugins like Stutter Edit and all that. And so I did, you roll up your sleeves and you do what needs to be done. And it was basically just manually editing his vocals on the timeline, like, setting the cursor to 30-second notes and making a shitload of chops and repeating just a few pieces. And to give it that sound that sounds like, like a bad, like a internet connection buffering or whatever, where it goes like, where his voice might do things like, I say, little micro repeats of things, but it was all just done manually because then I could have control over, I could not ruin the legibility of it, but still add this like weird cyber glitch texture to it. But it was done, like many things were in that era, done the hard way.
Yeah. People have no idea how much hard work went into the old days. It
was fun. We liked sitting up all night. You
hadn't heard it before. So it's like you're going to impress somebody with the amount of time you spent on it too.
I mean, at the time, every new thing like that would blow our minds and hopefully blow the minds of the listener. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, it's just an iPhone app called Revoice. It wasn't that kind of thing.
It's so kind of like boring to like know that you can do it so easily now. It's like, well, okay, you're hearing some mind warping effect that you would have paid like $1,000 before for it. You're like, forget it.
Exactly.
I don't know. Yeah, it's.
Well, I mean, that's part of the fact that you mentioned that is part of looking back why I've kind of shifted away from, hardware, but also electronic type sounds and processing. And, on most of the scores I do, there's not even any synthesizers of any kind. It's really? All just acoustic sounds that have been manipulated. I mean, I'm a sampler junkie and always have been. So most of the sounds in my template and in all my scores and everything, I literally have one synth sound just in case I need it, and it is the dumbest and simplest and stupidest sound. And it comes just from the stock Logic synth ES2. And it's just, an analog, a sound you could make on any freaking synth.
That Voyager's getting jealous back there.
Yeah, no, that's a Model D reissue.
Model D release.
Yeah, so over the years, I'd always had mini Moogs, but I never had one that worked 100%. I've had 4 before this one that were, original ones, and they were each broken in a different way, some more charming than others. But when Moog said they're reissuing a clone of the original, but with MIDI, I said, fine, I'm in. And
it does get used.
What's that?
So it does get used sometimes.
Oh yeah, that is a thing of beauty. And it's just a weird experience to play a mini Moog that's not beat to shit, And I mean, a perfect example from this movie Spiral that'll come out next year. The very first cue, Like I haven't even gotten into the panic mode yet where I'm like halfway through and I'm freaking out about whether I'll finish in time. Very first cue. It's like when the production company logos are flying across the screen, you know, like Lionsgate presents, that kind of shit. The music hasn't even started yet. So I wanted just the simplest, dumbest, most basic synth sound to accompany that logo flying like this. And it was literally just going to be like, just the most basic sound. So I mocked it up with Serum, with Steve Duda's synth plugin. It took 30 seconds to just put in a temporary and to get the attack and decay so it matched the movement of this logo. It took no time at all. And it sounded great. But of course, that was too easy, right? So I said, okay, we're going to break out the big guns now, you know, because I wasn't yet in a time panic over the deadline. So I broke out the Model D reissue. I have a TTSH 2600, the clone of the ARP 2600. I have my reissue Korg MS-20. I have my original MS-20 that I bought for $400 in 1981 or something. I have an MS-50 from back in the day.
Wow.
Had the Waldorf Quantum, Dave Smith Pro 3, the Super Jupiter. I'm like, it's the shootout. We're going to see who can do the dumbest, simplest, most basic synth sound the best. And if any of you can beat Steve Duda's Serum. And okay, the 2600, no balls. And the envelope, I know there's a mod that you could get that I should have gotten, but I don't have it, that makes the envelope longer. But it wouldn't go long enough to accompany this movement of this logo. So the 2600 was out the door. MS-20, it's not, there's no balls. It's nasty, but there's no. The Waldorf Quantum, good, but not, but a little like frozen sounding. Like it was, there wasn't like, because I was using the analog simulation oscillators. I wasn't using a sample. So it wasn't doing that like weird movement, internal movement thing. Minimoog Model D, holy fuck. It takes you 2 seconds to do it. And the range of the controls, of the attack and release controls, mean you can go from tiny little tight little pips to really long envelope. I need like 15-second attack and 15-second release. And you can get there, but you still have the precision to be able to get it exactly right, even though it has such a wide range. You can, and so it's just further testament to the genius of the original design that it took less time than using Serum did to get a sound that was better than what Serum could do. Sorry, Steve. Basically the same sound, but just has that weird Minimoog thing where things are just kind of, you know, you can hear the waveforms doing this behind each other, you know. And of course, it's just a mono output. So I tracked it 4 times, 4 separate passes, and then panned those around the 4 main speakers in a surround rig, and it sounds bloody lovely. Even though it's the most boring, simple sound ever, but 4 passes of Minimoog coming out in quad is just juicy and delicious.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it definitely gets some use.
And you'll hear that right at the very beginning of
it. Like before the movie's even go. Like
okay, that's it. I heard it. Go.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. I also saw in some photos that you had a pretty big wall of modular there next to you, but do you not have that anymore?
It's wrapped in plastic and around the back because it normally sits where the Minimoog goes. So, and it's a freaking time suck and it's a time vampire. But
what is that, a Euro rack? Was it a Euro rack?
Yeah, it's all Euro. And I haven't bought too many modules in the past couple years. It was probably about 06 or so. And I said, okay, fuck it, it's time, let's get in. And at the time, we didn't have the hailstorm of manufacturers that we have now. So you had, of course, Dupfer and a few other high-end manufacturers like Schwayman. I have a bunch of Schwayman modules that are now discontinued, like their voltage-controlled ADSRs and some other cool ones they made for a minute. And then you had like the beginnings of the weirdo boutique makers, like the Harvest Man, which I think now has a different name for the company.
Electronics.
Exactly. And those every module I have of his is amazing.
Yes,
Love them
okay.
all. Like the Time Safari and the Zorlon Cannon, they're freaking great. I love that. And then a few other kind of early boutique manufacturers, like I have a couple of the Livewire AFG oscillators, which are like super
Brilliant.
sophisticated oscillators. Really, you do like different pulse width mod on the top half and the bottom half of the waveform, and they're really nice sounding
oscillators. Rest in peace, Mike Brown.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and
I did get a few modules recently. There's this circuit bender dude named Shane over in England, and his handle is X1L3. And that's like, and he sells stuff on like a big cartel website, right? And normally he's doing stuff like circuit bending Yamaha toy drum computers and stuff, like, you know, and any of that particular generation of cheap digital instruments, which can be circuit bent, like Casio SK1, SK5, Alesis HR16. There's a whole kind of generation of instruments that can be bent. And he loves like industrial music and power electronics and like just ultra blast sounds. And I've gotten a few of his circuit bent instruments, but he's actually recently started making Eurorack modules that are in that vein of like power electronics. And I got a couple of them. One's called the Shard, which is like the most ripping, shredding distortion of all time. It's like just so utterly beyond. And so there's a few new goodies that are coming in, but I kind of, you know how the Eurorack stuff is. Every once in a while, you just got to sit down in front of the thing and like start unscrewing modules and be like, I never use you. I hate you. I don't know why I bought you. You're going. So I'm about due for like a new, to run a comb through it and to like get all the gray hairs out of it and make room for some new goodies.
Yeah, and that's me too. I've also heard that when you're scoring saw, that basically you're looking for. Did you get some custom stuff built? Some machines that make some very unusual things?
Oh yeah.
Well,
I mean, the big guy.
What are those guys called?
That stuff is mostly acoustic.
Formatrons or whatever it's called.
And let's see if I can get the camera to not fall over.
Uh-oh.
Did I drop out?
Yeah, we still hear you, but we don't see you. Your camera came unplugged.
Okay, let me just fiddling with it. You got no video, huh? Okay, let me fiddling.
There you are.
Okay, that's the laptop cam, but let me try to go back to the.
There's the other cam. We got it.
Okay. So yeah, this era, a good friend of mine, Peter Freeman, who I've known since 35 years or something, super golden ear, talented programmer, bass player, sound designer, maniac, played for many years and produced a few albums by John Hassel, the legendary ambient music artist. Also plays on a lot of scores by composers like Thomas Newman and people like that. An all-around sonic badass. He introduced me to this guy named Chaz Smith, who is another fucking genius, ridiculous. He's one of these guys who was at a ridiculous point in history. He went to Cal Arts up by Magic Mountain, wherever the hell it is, in the 70s when they had like the electronic music program.
Yep.
And it was the breeding ground for like, there was like a 3 or 4 year period where the students and faculty were like, that was the place to be.
Yep.
For experimental music, electronic music. He then went on to work at the Surge synthesizer company,
yep,
assembling and soldering the original paper-face Surge modules, and had one of the biggest Surge systems ever, which he only very recently, I mean, he's almost 70 now, only recently sold it to Danny Carey. from Tool.
I've seen it. Denny has it at one of his rooms of his.
And it's a big fucker and an old fucker, you know. But Chaz then went on to a career as a metal fabricator and welder, but also a musician. But for many years, he was, you know, how when you're at like at a fancy hotel in Barcelona and they'll have a sculpture out in front that looks like a wireframe whale. And it's the size of an actual whale, but it's balanced on like one little pivot point. And as the wind from the harbor blows, it's moving, you know, and you're looking at this thing, you're like, that's got to weigh 100 tons. And it's all custom built and welded and engineered to be balanced precisely on like one little pin or whatever. Who the fuck makes that? This guy, Chaz Smith, fabricates that. And he works for many years with ultra high-end sculptors and artists who design this stuff, but obviously can't build it themselves. They need like a team of specialized metal fabricators and engineers to make their crazy artistic designs come to life. And so for many years, Chaz had done that kind of work. And so as an offshoot, he knew metalworking and what types of alloys can be welded together and what kind of sound they make when you hit them, right? So he's been building the most amazing instruments for 40, 50 years, only for himself. He doesn't sell any of his instruments. He's not like, doesn't have a website where you can go add to cart, you know, but he spends ridiculous amounts of time finding the right alloy and the thickness of tube and the length and calculating the nodal points and the harmonic series that'll result when you have a rod that's 3x long with a hole drilled at 1x, and that kind of math and science applied to music. But he also does music that's non-12 tone scale, and he does microtonal music and on all around weird confluence of talents and skills that allow him to build these things, most of which he makes for himself. So my old buddy Peter introduced me to him right around the time I was doing the first Saw movie. I was like, shit, man, I only have this one bowed cymbal sample. I wish I had 1,000,000 of these. And he goes, I got someone you need to meet. He's going to be gun shy because he's done recording sessions in the past, and he would like get paid a bunch of money to make some sounds on Star Trek 1, the motion picture. And then Star Trek 2 would come out and there's his sounds on it again, and he didn't get paid again. So he doesn't like getting ripped off. So, and I was like, come on, man, I've been ripped off. I'm not going to rip anyone off. So I paid him basically 10% of my fee for doing the first Saw movie in return for him letting me use a few samples of his sounds, of his instruments that he had already sampled. You didn't have to do anything but like let me copy a few files. Then as I would reuse those sounds in additional Saw movies, I would continue to pay him basically 10% of my fee every time I would use a bunch of his sounds. And some of them became kind of like central sounds that are like this, you know, when something bad's going to happen, there was this one low growling sound that came from one of his instruments. So a few years ago, he was going to move from his house near me in Woodland Hills up to Northern California. And he's got like fucking forklifts and giant stacks of steel tubing, all this stuff he had to move. He doesn't sell his instruments, but there was one instrument that he built for somebody on commission, and that person didn't want it.
Wow.
The legend is that it was made for John Williams, who was writing a piece that, you know, I don't know if I have the story straight, but in theory, it's John Williams was writing some music for the opening, to be performed at the opening of the Disney Concert Hall downtown, the weird sheet metal one, and wanted a big kind of a metallic fanfare type of sound that would evoke the feeling of that, all that bent sheet metal on the outside of the building. So Chaz built this using a piece of sheet metal that looks like the outside of the building. It's not the same metal, and that creates just one note. It just plays one pitch. And what it is, and of course he fabricated everything. He made the stand and everything. And it's basically a pair of the thickest strings from a grand piano with a bridge and tuning pegs, and it stretches over these metal rods that act as like the bridge on a guitar. And it's hard to see, but this metal rod, the string goes out and over this through a hole in this bar, and then back to the bridge or to the nut. And there's one on each side, and they pinch the sheet in between them. And the sheet is hanging from strings, so that it's free, it's in the free air. So when these strings vibrate, they transmit their vibrations to the sheet. And it acts almost like a plate reverb kind of thing. You can sort of hear, it kind of sounds like a plate reverb almost. Right? But when you bow or strike the strings, you get some pretty impressive sounds.
Oh. Oh, wow.
And of course,
Beautiful.
you can also bow the sheet itself, much like you do a bowed cymbal type thing.
Man.
And then, because I liked one of the other instruments that he had, so when he was moving up to Northern California, because this instrument was one that was not like his personal collection, it was something he, in theory, had made for someone else. He said, I know how much you like that instrument, and you have managed to not rip me off for the past 10 years on these Saw movies. If you like, I will sell you that instrument. But bring your checkbook and a pen with a lot of ink, because there's going to be a lot of zeros behind that number. I was like, I'll pay any fucking price, dude. Because it's not like I'm buying one of these every week. This is like a one-shot deal. It's like, you want it, it's going to cost. I was like, fine. So I wrote him a check, a lot of zeros at the end, and he let me keep this instrument. And then, because I like one of the other instruments he had called Lockheed, this one's called Kelastas. And he had another instrument called Lockheed that had a bunch of small rods sticking out that could be bowed and struck. Originally, this didn't have these, but he added all of these little rods, again, calculated to be like the harmonic. It's a third, it's a fifth, whatever. So, and he's welded all this stuff together and fabricated it. There's different weights and counterweights welded on to create the desired harmonic whatever. But that gives you a whole nother kind of collection of sounds that it can make.
Wow.
So this thing is sort of like a horror movie toolbox.
It really sounds like it. It's really beautiful.
And to record it couldn't be simpler. You just like point a mic vaguely in its direction, and it just sounds like that, It's not like difficult. It's not like, oh, I've got to use a contact mic, and then we're going to put a KM84 up close. Just put any old mic anywhere near it, and it sounds like this. So that instrument has been a big player in the Saw movies.
The secret weapon.
The sounds from the strings, those big growly, low-pitched sounds, I really only use that sound on the Saw movies, and I don't allow it to be part of anything else. But the other stuff, like the bowed kind of shrieks and scrapes from the rest of the instrument, I have used those on other things. Let me just reposition me camera.
That's cool that it gets a special place. It's like the Saw instrument.
Exactly. It's like it's become a signature that sort of, let's see if I can work this focus at all. That big growling sound, that looks great, became like the signature for certain moments in the movie. So
yeah, I definitely recognize it.
It's like a certain kick drum that you only use on one song.
Right, I mean? Yeah. So you were saying you really like the Waldorf Quantum?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a fan of, the original microwave, then the XT, And stupidly, when it was still a current product that was being sold by Waldorf, I'm still good friends with Joff Farr, who was the Waldorf rep and is a great dude and just an enthusiastic boutique synth dealer. And this would have been, I don't know, 97 or so. We were in New Orleans and he said, oh, the Waldorf came out with the new flagship, the Wave. Remember the big one?
Yeah, huge.
And he sent one down to us in New Orleans. And I thought, of course, Trent's going to want this. He's going to be like, yeah, I'll have 10. And Trent was like, not feeling it. And I couldn't afford one at the time. All right, maybe I could, but even I think at the time I was kind of like, I got a microwave. What do I need this big old boat anchor for? And none of us bought one. We could have had it like for a good price, and none of us bought one. So
wasn't
I've
there
always
like
kind of
non-working sections of it that made it seem less appealing?
There were some issues. Yeah. And what was appealing is that you could load in put a wave file on a floppy disk, stick that in the drive, and it would extract single cycle waveforms from that sample and convert it into a wavetable, which was something we used to do in the TurboSynth software to create like mutated guitar hits and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was very appealing. And it didn't sound as good as just doing it in TurboSynth, which we already had.
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing is, the Waldorf Wave is one of the sexiest looking keyboards of all time. When you see one, you're like, oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about, you know.
Like a Corvette or something.
Exactly. But it had some functional issues and some reliability issues. And the demo unit that we had, it has a tilt up panel like a mini mode. Yeah. And it has like gas shocks like you use on the hatchback of your car. Yeah. And to hold it in place. And the demo unit we had, the gas shocks were failing. So like you tilt the panel up and it would go, whoa. Like, really, bro? On an $8,000 synth? Like you can't, make that work. Like put a thumb screw on or whatever. So we sent it back and none of us bought one. But here we are years later. And Waldorf has come out with the Quantum, which, let's see if it's...
Now we got tricky. Oh, yeah.
There we go. And let's see if I can even do the... Oh, yeah.
Oh, even trickier.
Yeah. And it's, it's a bad mofo. It's basically all the promise of the Waldorf Wave fulfilled, It does take a sample and convert it to a wavetable if you want to do something that mundane, but it also has a full like granular time stretch and granular synthesis engine and a virtual analog synthesis engine, as well as like this resonator model, which is some weird sort of Karplus Strong kind of algorithm. And of course, like old school PPG Waldorf microwave style wavetable stuff. And actual hardware analog filters, as well as a bunch of digital filter algorithms, and everything on it sounds good. And let's see if I can find something that's interesting. Are you able to hear it coming through? Yep. One great function is that it has a knob on it, which is not saved with the preset for compression. So if any sound is just too wimpy, you can just turn up the compression knob and just like.
Oh, that's happy.
All right, let's find something good. Has a great step sequencer in it, which will allow for really elaborate sort of rhythmic patterns. And let's get into some of the granular stuff. Everything is sort of real-time controllable. And of course, it has sort of Fairlight / Waveterm style wavetable viewing, so you can see where you are in the wavetable. You can sweep everything from mod wheels and so forth. And then it also has this granular sample. It can act as a sample player or a sampler, basically. but it also has this granular engine where it may not be easy to see, but there's a little red line moving through the sample that's showing you where you are in the sample, and it's a simple matter to like freeze or scroll or scrub your way through the sample. But that's just a bunch of samples of like a choir or something that are being played back very slowly, but at a normal pitch.
Nice.
And it was one of those, like, I would normally, just based on, it looks good on paper, so I probably would have bought it anyway. But I was at the NAMM show when they were first bringing it out, and it was just a case of playing it, even with the kind of wacky factory presets they had in it. You could kind of hear that it was something special. And it's the actual sound of it. Like if I just take a sample that I know very well and that I'm using in Contact or EXS on the computer and just transfer that exact sample into this and just play it back without any funny business, it sounds a little better. Like there's a little bit of a smiley EQ and there's a bit of some kind of weight put behind it. So as you know, as you can see, I don't have a ton of synths in the room, but that one's like on the top shelf.
That's probably
both metaphorically and physically.
It's probably better to not have so many distractions around, though. Do you find that you have too many things? It's like,
oh yeah. I mean, you know, it's hard to divorce yourself from that way of thinking because, you know, coming up in the 80s and 90s,
sure,
if you want two sounds playing at once, you need two synthesizers turned on at once.
Yeah.
So you know, we all wound up with fucking roomfuls of modules and racks and keyboards and, oh, I'm going to keep this one synth because it only does one thing.
That's me.
But now, obviously, the times have changed and the technology has changed. So you don't need to keep a fucking army of every keyboard that had one good sound on it, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's true. You liking the Pro 3 as well?
I actually have the Pro 2.
Oh, Pro 2. Yeah, same.
Which I love, and it serves when the Euro rack is in place. The Pro 2 is kind of underneath the Quantum, and the Pro 2 serves as the step sequencer and front end kind of for the CV gate side of the Euro rack. So it's great because then you have like something that resembles a keyboard, has a step sequencer, has MIDI clock, and can then control what else you're doing on the Euro rack. For that, it's great. I do mean to check out the Pro 3, but I've been really happy with the Pro 2, so it's not a critical concern to make the switch.
Yeah. I don't know. I was interested in trying it too. I just thought the Pro 2 was something I didn't end up using as much as Steve's synth, the Serum.
Yeah. I mean, the Pro 2, there's about its internal sounds, there's something that's a little,
yeah.
There's 2 or 3 categories of sounds I love on it, like sort of noise percussion, step sequencer, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for like funky bass or like soaring lead or whatever, no, thank you. But I wasn't going to use it for that anyway.
It kind of was like, hitting me middle groundish, and I thought like maybe the Pro 3 would open up the door a little more. Have you
tried the Pro 3 yet?
I haven't physically. I've seen them online and listened to the demos, but a few of my friends have it and swear by it. And then, of course, the Waldorf Quantum is the other one that everyone is saying they can't live without this one.
Okay, good. So I'm not an outlier on the Quantum love. Okay, good.
You can't really lose with the Quantum in the sense of all the forms of synthesis mixed into one sound creation. So, you know, I mean, especially even for you as a guy that has to find something that's far from stock and something that's going to be appealing for a film. I mean, that's going to be probably a very good palette for you to start.
Yeah. I mean, cinematic is a good word to describe its sound in general. So it was a no-brainer, really.
that leads us to American Horror Story, man. I mean, you gave me a story yesterday that you were telling me the full circle of the story of the theme. Everyone loves that theme, and I mean, you must have a lot of people talk to you about it.
And I mean, I love it too, even though it's one that did not spring fully formed from my brain. And the circular story is that, okay, remember the movie Seven, the Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and in the main titles to Seven, they used as the music Coil's remix of Nine Inch Nails' Closer, which is basically a Coil track with a few manipulated samples of Trent's voice. It's not like a version of the song. It's like a whole new audio sculpture that Coil built. And it has a really great impact. And it's dark and evil and scary and awesome. So when they're starting American Horror Story, before they've really even, way before it's on the air, they're designing the main title sequence. And Ryan Murphy, the show creator, said he wanted the visuals and the sonic landscape of the main titles to the show to have that vibe from the movie Seven, like shaky camera and scratchy writing and an unsettling piece of music that had that same kind of quality. One of the video editors, one of the guys working on the picture edit crew, had done a piece of music 10, 20 years earlier. When he was in college, after he went and saw Seven at the movie theater and loved that Coil track, he went back to his dorm room and broke out his beige Dell desktop PC or whatever, and using Cool Edit Pro, that 4-track audio program from back in the day, made a piece of music that was inspired by that Coil remix from Seven. And he was doing things like he would take a handful of wire coat hangers and throw them on the floor in the tiled bathroom in his dorm, and then time stretch them by 8,000% in Cool Edit, which was a terrible algo. So it resulted in those sounds that are all throughout that piece of music. They're like these chainsaw blast kind of, like that's little tiny snippets of sound that he time stretched. And then he would sample dripping water in the sink and make that into a hi-hat. And he was having a blast. Cut to 20 years later, he's working on this picture edit crew. Showrunner says, I need a piece of music I want this to have that Seven vibe. He goes, I have this piece of music I did a long time ago. We could just use as like a scratch track to like give us the vibe as we're editing the picture. Then I'm sure eventually you're going to hire a real composer to do it for quote, for real, unquote. So they put his piece of music in there. And he didn't have like the stems or the multi-tracks or the sampler. All he had was a mix, just a stereo mix of it. They put that in. They start editing the picture. They're loving it. And it's in that music that he had done is inspiring them to do these dark visuals and these shaky edits and everything. It comes out great. Ryan Murphy loves it. Comes time to pick, to quote, do it for real. They figure, hey, one of the guys that used to be in Nine Inch Nails is now scoring. He's done a bunch of TV series and a bunch of main title themes already. Let's get him. They get me. I spend a month I think I'd wound up with 4 different versions of brand new pieces of music from scratch, but that still had some of the vibe of the 7 main titles and some of the vibe of this piece of music they were using as a temp, which was originally done by this guy named Cesar Davila Irizarry. So Cesar had done this music years and years ago. I did 4 different versions, and each time Ryan and the other producers would go, there's still something about that track that Caesar did in college that just has, and okay, I'll take another swing at it, guys. Another week, I do a whole nother version, all different music. I'm trying to regenerate sounds that are like those chainsaw blast kind of noise blasts. And I did some cool versions, but still they're like, you know what? There's just something. And then, after version 4, I think I did 4 versions of new music. And then finally, like the call comes in is there any way? I'm like, yeah, just give me the stereo mix of dude's original track. And I, using audio forensic techniques would extract those chainsaw blasts and try to filter out any of the drums behind it. And I found one little hi-hat hit from his dripping water sample. I was able to isolate that. but he had used like an illegal sample of like off some like there was like a stand-up bass loop that was off some Latin jazz record that at its normal pitch was like boom 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 boom, and he had slowed it way down to make that boom 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 boom. And so I couldn't use that, and I had to change it. So I changed. I didn't want to like just make my own sample that used this stolen bass line. So I actually changed the bass line a bunch, but tried to recapture that boom boom. So I used, a few elements from that I extracted from his original. I tried to recapture the vibe of his original, and I changed what couldn't be used for copyright reasons. And the result was a co-write between me and him, and because it was fundamentally based on his original work. So I did put in some serious labor, but it didn't go to waste, because I guess if you buy the DVD box set or whatever, there's a 3-minute they had me make them a 3-minute version where I used all 4 of my original unapproved demos, and they were all done, fortunately, at the same tempo to match the picture edit, and in the same key. So I was able to merge and splice those 4 unused demos into one like super version that's like 3.5 minutes long, and that is used somewhere. I can't remember if it's the DVD menu screen or where exactly it is in the home video releases, but all that time did not go to waste, fortunately.
And there's been a newer version, wasn't there, along the way? Didn't they?
Yes.
Like kind of update it? Yeah.
Exactly. Because for a while, James Levine was scoring the show. And then at one point they changed the whole lineup of the show, and then it was, American Horror Story Freak Show, and it was set in a circus in the 50s or something. And I think around that same time, they switched composers, and James Levine was off, and Matt Quayle came in as the new composer, and they would have him I did the first few where they're like, can you just add like some new layer to the original theme that evokes the theme of this year's show? And I had done a couple of them in the first few years. And I think once Mac came on, I think I might have done the circus one, because I remember using like a calliope and a steam organ sample and trying to add that. But then in later years, once Mac came on as the composer, he would then do a new version every year. So he'd use like the chassis of my original, me and Caesar's original, and then he would add some new elements to kind of so it smelled like this year's concept.
It's kind of like what it sounded like. Maybe they added an extra tick 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 or an extra sound.
And then he did like there was one season where it was like sort of 80s retro vaporwave vibe, and he did like a whole 80s slasher synth version.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really good. So you haven't been involved in the actual scoring of the show itself? Or
no, not at all. No, just that theme. Because at that point, I think when I did that theme, I was still running 2 weekly TV series during the winter and spring, and then in the summer I would do a Saw movie and one other movie. So I was like, I'm not trying to. I mean, some guys want to have a big fucking army of dudes working for them so they can churn out like 8 shows, whatever. But they're not doing all 8 shows, bro. It's the assistants that are doing it. They write typically they'll write the first episode of the season, and then tell the assistants, okay, now start extracting shit from that and imitate my style and or extract stuff from episode 1 and populate the whole season. And like, I hate doing that because I don't want to be just like a manager of talent. I don't want to be instructing other people how to do that. I want to do it. It's fun, man. So I'd rather have fewer gigs, do them all myself. I don't have any assistants, no interns. But at that point, I was doing 2 weekly series and 2 movies a year. And I did have a couple guys working for me just because it was just insane. These weren't these 10 episode series like fucking HBO puts on now. They're like season 3. And you're like, it's 10 episodes. It's nothing. These were network shows, 10 episodes. They were 23 episodes a season, one every week for 6 months. And, you'd do like 5 and then you'd have a week off while there was like preempted for like the election or something, and then you'd be another 5, and then you got a week off because it's a Christmas Charlie Brown Christmas special or something. But
So you
so
never looked at
that's why I kind of like, it would have been nice to I mean, American Horror Story would have been the kind of show I would have liked to have scored, but at the time it just wasn't practical. I had too much other stuff grinding at the moment.
So you feel okay with that type of schedule, with that type of deadline? It doesn't like hammer on you too heavily?
I mean, I did in my 40s.
Yeah.
I can still do it because look, that Australian composer had a great piece of wisdom for me once. He said, look, never worry about deadlines because work occupies a state of matter that is gaseous. It will always expand to fill all the available time.
Perfect.
So if they give you a year to do it, still that last week of that year, you'll be freaking out trying to like scramble to get the shit done. If they give you a week to do it, you'll scramble just as hard. So, I can still do that. The kind of gigs I've been on lately don't require that level of insanity, but I'm ready to jump back on that horse. If the shit hits the fan, it's fine. And also working those kind of shows for so many years, I did like almost 300 hours worth of network TV. It was ridiculous. And I developed a very organized method of putting previous cues into just the stereo mixes into categorized folders so that when the picture editors are trying to slap together a temp score for this week's episode, they can use my music from previous episodes, but they don't have to sit there and go, wasn't there a cool car chase piece of music from like season 2, episode 9? I wonder what. Instead, I give them folders that are so categorized, they can like look in a folder called, this was a crime show where there's FBI agents, they look in a folder called, FBI field work, meaning this is not FBI agents sitting in front of a computer. This is FBI agents out chasing shit. Then there's a subfolder called chases, and there'll be another subfolder called heists, and another subfolder called hostages. And so they could drill down into these folders and find the correct piece of music. So their temp score that they would deliver to me every week was already made from my music.
That's awesome.
And it wasn't like the wrong kind of music because they were able to find the right or a mostly correct piece of music to use as something like this.
Yeah.
So that made it that much easier for me to build a score without a bunch of back and forth and a bunch of like, yeah, it's good, but could you try this? And so a lot of those times, I did actually calculate it once, and I had, I basically had a above 90% no-hitter ratio, meaning here's a cue. What do you think? Fine. Here's a cue. What do you think? It's fine. So it was over 90% went through on the first try without, could you just put like 2 notes of piano when we see the dead girl, could you just 2 notes of piano? And that last 10% is where I had to add the 2 notes of piano on the dead girl's picture or whatever,
Man, this is incredible advice that you're giving. I gather this is something, you've learned over the course of your career and you applied to yourself. It's invaluable. You could almost say we could have the Charlie Clouser book of how to do things now.
I mean, it's some of it's, I suppose I should see how much they're paying over at that masterclass website. See if they'll, see if they'll let me repackage all this not because, because look, in many of the gigs, like working in the nails operation, a big part of what they dumped in my lap was just make sure none of the data gets lost. Like, so at one point I was making the live backing tapes.
Yeah.
So I had to have all the elements from every song that Nails had ever recorded as separate tracks. So that Trent said, hey, we got 3 days off. Could you whip up a playback tape with clicks for this song that we've never played before? And I'd have to know that I had the multi-track on a hard drive with everything separated and labeled. And so having that kind of organizational skill behind the computer helps. You have a big sound library, a big sample library, whatever, but it also helps in organizing the workflow of scoring and keeping track of versions and all that kind of junk. So it wasn't a foreign set of skills that I had to like learn by force. It was kind of it was a part of what I was already doing on so many other records over the years. So fortunately it wasn't a big learning curve. It was just like, don't want to get myself into trouble by not having this shit organized. You know,
I think that's probably the best way to look at it, is that you could see the potential for trouble and you were eliminating that ahead of time.
That's exactly it. I was like, whoa, this could get ugly fast. And in fact, the very first series I scored, it did get ugly because I wasn't keeping track of what key things were in. So I would have these ugly moments where later they would want to reuse a particular piece of music. They'd be like, oh, that one beat it was kind of a hip hop themed buddy cop show, like a Lethal Weapon kind of thing. But it had a lot of hip hop influences and a lot of like breakbeat kind of stuff. And there'd be a point where they'd be like, oh, we want to use this one cue, but we need it to cross with this other one. So I'd have these moments where like, you know, something in D is crossing against something in F, and you get these stanky moments. So later I learned to like really be diligent and make sure that I was doing everything in complementary keys, and that so I didn't have these stanky cheese moments when two cues need to overlap, you know.
You've also worked, I guess, a couple of video games, with one particularly Evolve with Lustmord. I love Lustmord.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah. Do you like working in video games, or is that a different world?
You know, maybe someday. I don't know. I gotta say, they, you know, from the video, I'm sure most people doing this kind of thing, having a room full of synthesizers, people like Lustmord, whoever, love it. Or like the guy that did, I'm blanking on his name, but the guy that did Doom a while back, who did like crazy, was his name Mitch, maybe, I think, who did like crazy fucking distortions where he'd like pull up the spectral image of the sound and he'd draw like an upside down pentagram and then like reconvert it back to audio. And, you know, he did like a really cool, super distorted, fucking very NIN sounding, like broken second album sounding score to one of the many versions of the Doom video game. But for me, when I'm scoring, I need to see the story taking place on the screen, because that's your roadmap. That's like basically your marker track that tells you when the fucking verse, when the chorus, when the,
right.
You know, it's for me, scoring to picture, whether it's a TV series, a movie, whatever, it's fucking easy. It's the easiest possible thing to do in music, because the whole roadmap is right there. There's none of the agony of making records like, should we have a 64 bar drum machine distortion pedal intro? Yeah. Or is that too long? Should it maybe only be 32 bars? Right. It's like all those questions are already answered by the picture.
Yeah.
When you sit down first with the video game creative team, they're like, oh, this sounds like this would be the ideal job for a composer, because you don't have to match what's on picture. You can just like create a mood and make it 3 minutes long, and then make it seamlessly loop and make sure you stem it out so that every stem can be played into all by itself. And that like, if we mute two of the stems, it won't sound like something's missing. It'll just sound like more energy. And so I'm thinking right away, I'm thinking, so are you going to give me picture to score to? And they're like, well, we can give you like random quick times of somebody playing through a half finished level, but don't make your music link up to any of the action, because the action's all player controlled.
Right.
And then the other factor was, at least on some of the early games that I did, they did need every cue to loop seamlessly. So now there's no arc, or maybe there's an arc, but it's got to come right back to, you know, where it started so that it can loop. And sure, it can be a minute, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes long, but it does need to loop in case the player's just camping out at the spawn point or whatever. So then they also wanted, at least on one of the games, they wanted 3 energy levels to be thought of as stems, so that when you first walk into the fucking abandoned reactor or whatever it is, there's layer A is playing. And then after a while, a few bad guys come out and they start shooting at you, whatever. Now level B comes in, adds some energy and pace, like maybe it's faster rhythms. But A is still playing. Then when like the big motherfuckers come out with the BFGs, now C comes in and all three are playing and the shit's really hitting the fan and it's a full-on full court press. And now you kill one of the dudes, but like you're still at the end of that level. So now A is going to drop out. And now we're just going to have B and C playing. And maybe B will drop out and we'll just leave C playing. So,
wow, so
now you're faced with trying to make these energy levels, layers of music, potentially, not, it wasn't always the case, but potentially in some scenarios where sure, you need to be able to add B and then add C, but you might also need to take away A. So like what happens if that's your drums? Like, are we just going to hear like some fucking synth bass pulsing away for no reason? Like it was a logistical challenge / nightmare to create a piece of music and then to have to like separate the elements or already have been thinking of in those terms along the way. I guess in some respects, some restrictions and limitations are a good thing, quote unquote, but it was a pain in my fucking ass, basically. Yeah. And it became difficult because, I mean, this was 10 years ago, but and it was like Xbox and I think there were PC games as well. So some of the development tools that allow a composer to like test out how these things are working weren't available to me at that time. Now, established and experienced game composers have these tools like Fmod and Wise that are software tools that allow them to simulate how player interaction is going to affect what they hear. And they can do a rough mock-up of some stems, drop them into this thing that's not the video game engine. It's like a music player engine. And because you can't they can't send you the half-finished video game. It's not going to be done for another fucking year or something. They send you some wireframe thing. You're like, what is this? It doesn't give you a sense of what it's like to be in there. They can send you still pictures of concept art so you can get the vibe and be like, oh yeah, it's acid melting everything and everything's rusty. You can get a vibe, but you're not in the game. So, and at that time, I didn't have a bunch of PCs, which many of the development tools ran on. So it was a matter of, I realized it's probably easier than I made it. And it's easier now than it was then because of the maturity of some of those tools that let the music team model and simulate what's going to happen in the final game. But I prefer movies and TV.
Oh, yeah. It's also nice that, when you're working on movies that they deliver it to you kind of in broken down scenes. And so usually they're I guess people that haven't worked in that, they think like, oh, you have to think about the whole 2-hour movie and think about, wait, no. It's like you break down the action and all these things, and then you see how those scenes move. And then that becomes a little easier to handle than thinking about like something that doesn't exist, because you are the first person that gets to see the response to that scene and how it makes you feel. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, you're the first person that gets scared by the movie.
Exactly. And it, a lot of composers in interviews are like, oh yeah, well, we'll have 20 different versions of the movie by the time I'm done. They keep sending me new edits and new cuts. And I'm always thinking, what kind of fucking disorganized people are you working with? Because that never happens to me. Now, admittedly, I'm not doing like some fucking movie like Avengers or whatever, where like the future of the entire Western world economy rides on whether this movie's a hit or not. So maybe it's obviously, it's very different for a Saw movie or whatever. But when I get them, they're basically done. And like, they don't come back to me over and over and go, oh yeah, we changed 3 frames. Maybe once or twice per movie will they say, oh, I hope, and they're always like, oh, I hope this isn't too much of a problem. We cut out 1 second and 3 frames here and 7 frames there because of the rating from the MPAA. We had to shorten the scene where the guy's arm gets pulled out of its socket or whatever. But it's never like, okay, here's today's version of the picture for you to work on. It's very, at least on the things I've been on, they've been much more cut and dried, and it hasn't been like this hailstorm of revisions. And of course, on a weekly TV series, there's no revisions, bro. We spot the show, have a meeting and we look at the show on Tuesday and it mixes the following Tuesday and it's on the air on Wednesday. I mean, it was that close. There'd be times when I'd be watching, it'd be Friday night. At one point I had 2 shows on Friday night, one on CBS, one on NBC, and I'm flipping between them. And I'd be watching one show end and they'd be like, next week on, and they show you like a little, 30-second preview of next week's episode. And I'm looking at scenes that I haven't seen yet because I haven't started working on that yet. And so you're like, I hope to go, well, yeah, okay. Next week on, you better hope that's what you're going to be seeing next week because we haven't started it yet. So it got very close, but, so, and we never had never missed a deadline, never missed an air, never left them hanging. And that was another, one of the lessons from the Australian composer was like, don't ever tell Emma a story. There's no fucking dog ate my homework bullshit. Zero. If all you have finished when the messenger shows up to pick up the tape or whatever it might be, if all you have finished is a fucking hi-hat and 2 bass notes, you tell them, that hi-hat and those 2 bass notes are what you intended. That's the finished version of the cue. That's it. Don't ever tell them a story about, oh, can I just have another day? Oh, I'm going to be a little late on the thing. It's okay to tell some of those stories to like the functionaries, like the underlings, the music editor who's on the dub stage in Canada, who's waiting for you to upload the latest cue. It's okay to call him on his cell phone and go, bro, tell me what the time code number is that you guys are at right now. Be like, oh, we're at 2 hours and 12 minutes. Be like, okay, I'm at 3 hours and I'm 20 minutes ahead of you guys mix in the movie. So, okay, don't tell anyone. I'll be uploading the cue in 15 minutes. So, but you don't ever go to like the producers or the executives or the network or anybody that could have any possibility of firing you or replacing you. No fucking stories, no bullshit. No, I couldn't get to my hard drive. Oh, my synth, my guitar string broke. I couldn't rent a ukulele at 3 a.m. There's no bullshit. So that was one great lesson. And another great lesson that nobody seems to talk about was he always told me, plan on being out of work 2/3 of the time in the best case scenario. Now, this Australian composer was a dude who didn't give a shit about being a fucking film composer. He was an ex-record producer. He had done bands like Ice House in Australia and he loved Roxy Music and Brian Eno. And he didn't really give a shit about being a film composer, but he wound up doing this Equalizer TV series. And then after that ended, he would go off and spend 2 years making a documentary about some Japanese scientist with his wife, who was a filmmaker. So he was like a well-rounded Renaissance man. But he always said, plan on being out of work 2/3 of the time. Therefore, if they pay you $15,000 to do something, don't spend more than $5,000 while you're doing it. Then you have the other 2 chunks of $5,000 for the time when you're unemployed. And that runs pretty counter to what you see a lot of up and coming composers doing, where they're just like, they're trying to set up 3 rooms with matching rigs. They're buying they're spending every penny that comes in as it comes in. And the other part of the Australian man's lesson was the royalties, the performance royalties, you BMI or ASCAP for whatever, don't spend 0. That's for later. That's for when you're done and can't work, won't work, or can't get work. And he's like, while you're, quote, up and running, spend 1/3 and plan on being out of work 2/3. Then once it's all over and it's all come crashing down and no one's going to hire you because your style is crusty and old and no one gives a shit, then crack open that fucking shoebox and see what the royalties are worth. And he was like, any other course of action lies pain and disaster. That said, when he died a few years ago, he was absolutely fucking broke. But he also never gave a shit about working. Yeah. And he would just as soon go off with his wife and make some documentary for no money because it was something he was interested in, sure. So
all of his passion.
Exactly. Exactly. Fortunately, my passion is in fiddling with sounds, which has the potential at least to earn.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you have been found this space, and today's chat is masterclass plus, dude. mean, congratulations on the
Just be glad I didn't
getting the
fucking
audience here.
pull up my DAW screen. Just be glad we don't start scrolling through tracks on my rig and auditioning sounds. You'll have to buy some more hard drives to hold all the recording time we take.
With all this said, are you working on any new music that will be actually just specifically for music purposes, or?
No.
No, you don't need to.
You know, in about, I guess it was 99, 2000, just right around when I was fixing to leave Nails. Somebody showed me, I mean, this was right at the very beginning of, I can't remember if it was Napster or LimeWire or what it was, but right at we're just starting to see like peer-to-peer and sharing of MP3s and stuff. It was before iTunes and iPods and the Apple Store, but already like somebody showed me that and I was like, we're fucking done for. That's it. Because I knew that like Nine Inch Nails fans will steal everything that is not nailed down. They'll go in your dressing room and go through your fucking bags. And I mean, they don't give a shit. And I remember when Lars Ulrich was taking much flack from the public for being a zillionaire rock star with an art collection and then telling people they couldn't download the new Metallica, it was wrong for them to steal a Metallica album. And everybody's giving him all this shit like, fuck you, I only make $9 a day at the fucking Hot Topic at the mall. I can't afford the new Metallica album. So therefore I should be allowed to steal it. And I remember getting into it with some fucking NIN fans backstage at a meet and greet where they were like, yeah, fuck Lars, fuck that dude. And I was like, you don't understand, man. A Metallica record doesn't just pop out of the fucking somebody's laptop. It takes an 18-wheeler full of snare drums, a 747 full of guitar amps, and like forklift pallets of guitar strings and drumsticks. It's not just like an easy thing to do. Now, you may say, it's all bullshit. They could have just made it GarageBand style like Dave Grohl. But you know what? They didn't. They went the hard way. They took the time. It was done in big studios. I mean, if you ever watch those documentaries where Bob Rock is recording the Black Album or whatever, it's mental what they went through.
Yeah.
And like, you don't like it, don't buy it. We're not forcing you to buy it, but if you like it, fucking pay for it. And that was my viewpoint then and now. And I took much shit from these NIN fans that were like, no, fuck that. We're broke. I was like, well, then guess what? You don't save your pennies like I did when I was a kid. And like Metallica did when they were a kid, but I saw, when I first saw like the file sharing shit, I knew that like the record company was, the model that we had come up in, at least that Nails and bands like White Zombie and that kind of thing had come up in, was going to change drastically. And that the revenue from the recorded music part, which is the only part I gave a shit about, like that was the part I enjoyed and wanted to participate in. That revenue was going to get torpedoed and would have to get replaced by $60 hoodies and $40 belt buckles at the swag stand at the show, higher concert ticket prices, and whatever tertiary forms of revenue from endorsing fucking eyeliner or whatever that everybody seems to do now. But the only part I wanted to participate in was the making of the records, and I knew that the money would go, and it did. And like I enjoyed participating in records that had dozens of highly skilled, highly trained people that each had one specialized area. You had a guitar tech, guitar player, and a guy that rebuilds guitars. Then you had a drum tech and a custom drum maker, and then the guy that actually plays the drums. And you had guys like me that all I do is fuck with loops and samples, and I don't sing and I don't play guitar, And I enjoyed participating in those big juggernaut fucking Manhattan Project style records. And I knew that the money wasn't, the economy of the recording industry and the concert industry wasn't going to support those same kind of things. Now, fortunately, the technology made it so, you don't need Lars Ulrich's 747 full of snare drums. Now you just need a couple of plugins, maybe $600 total expenditure, and you got every snare drum in the world. Okay, fine. But that accelerated my lack of interest to continue participating in the record industry that I was involved in, because those kind of projects were kind of going away. Yeah. And like, so many people that used to have profitable careers as a functionary within the industry, not as the star, but as the guy that retunes vocals using an Eventide harmonizer or whatever. All of a sudden, the combination of technology being better and more advanced, and the revenues from the recording and consequentially recording budgets dropping, there's all these niches that like got erased or squozed down really small. So it's tragic, but I don't want to necessarily try to tough it out with today's record industry, such as it is, where the artist has to also be their own web designer, webmaster, photographer, video director, social media feed manager. They have to have a Discord server and a Twitch channel and a weekly, just the mayhem of trying to keep one's profile up and to self-market as many. And I have friends that do that and enjoy it and do it quite well, but those were not the parts that I enjoyed about the process. And for me, scoring is the maximum amount of the parts I enjoyed about the process. Basically sitting in a room, making interesting sounds and assembling them into a piece of music that works for a particular function. And no, there's no concert, there's no t-shirt, there's no $60 hoodie. It's just me and the music and done. And it's a much simpler way for me to live.
That's the way. And you've been very very articulate on so many levels today. I think that people should have gotten a lot out of this. And
good. I hope they don't get bored to shit.
Well, it's definitely teamwork that you've been involved with that help take things to the finish and help them be successful. So,
yes.
You've definitely been involved with a lot of successes, and the induction of 9 Inch Nails into the Hall of Fame should rightfully include everybody. And I just want to say congratulations for your contribution and to everything, Charlie. You're an inspiration.
Well, I've been
everybody
very lucky for sure to be in the wrong place at the right time, whatever.
Yeah.
But as grandma always used to say, opportunity might knock, but you better be fully dressed when you open the door. So like that is kind of part of it. It's like, you got to be prepared. So if they say, hey, do you want to score this film? You won't be like, how do you score a film? You had to already have been thinking about it. Like, well, if I ever got the chance to score a film, this is what I would do.
Yeah.
You got to at least put on a bathrobe before you answer the door, But I have been lucky, and I'm super grateful to Cameron Allen, the Australian composer who hired me when I was just a kid to actually pay me money to work on music. And of course, to Rob Zombie and all the guys from Prong and all these bands that let me do remixes and programming. And of course, to Trent for letting me be a part of his rocket to the moon for X amount of time. His Rock and Roll Hall of Fame thing, super well-deserved, even though back in the day, we used to think that was kind of a corny thing. Now the shoe's on the other foot now that they're inducting him and Depeche Mode and The Cure got in last year or the year before, whatever it was. So
cool.
Well-deserved. And, congratulations to him and all the rest of the guys.
Headed the right way.
Yeah.
Charlie, I think you take the record for the longest chat we've done, and I thank you for that. And I thank you, sir, for joining us today here. I hope the rest of your day is as fun as what it's been for us here. But I thank you for everything today.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
Let's do this again sometime.
I'd love to. We can geek out on some technical stuff. All right. Bye, everyone.